Fantastic Audio presents Five Nights at Freddy's, Book 2, The Twisted Ones, by Scott Cawthon and Kira Breed Risley. Read by Suzanne Elise Freeman. Chapter 1. Don't trust your eyes. Dr. Treadwell walked back and forth across the platform at the front of the auditorium. Her steps were slow and even, almost hypnotic. Your eyes deceive you every day, filling in the blanks for you in a world of sensory overload. An image of dizzying geometric detail lit up the canvas screen behind her. When I say sensory overload, I mean that quite literally. At every moment, your senses are receiving far more information than they can process all at once, and your mind is forced to choose which signals to pay attention to. It does that based on your experiences and your expectation of what is normal. The things we are familiar with are the things we can, for the most part, ignore. We see this most easily with olfactory fatigue. Your nose ceases to perceive a smell when you've been around it for a while. You may be quite thankful for this phenomenon, depending on the habits of your roommate. The class tittered dutifully, then became quiet as the image of another multicolored design flashed onto the screen. The professor gave a hint of a smile and continued. Your mind creates motion when there is none. It fills in colors and trajectories based on what you've seen before, and calculates what you should be seeing now. Another image flashed onto the overhead screen. If your mind didn't do this, then simply walking outside and seeing a tree would consume all your mental energy, leaving no resources to do anything else. In order for you to function in the world, your mind fills in the spaces of that tree with its own leaves and branches. 100 pencils scribbled all at once, filling the lecture hall with a sound like scurrying mice. It's why when you enter a house for the first time, you experience a moment of dizziness. Your mind is taking in more than usual. It's drawing a floor plan, creating a palette of colors, and saving an inventory of images to draw on later, so you don't have to go through that exhausting intake every single time. The next time you enter that same house, you'll already know where you are. Charlie! An urgent voice whispered her name, inches from her ear. Charlie kept writing. She was staring straight ahead at the display at the front of the lecture hall. As Dr. Treadwell went on, she paced faster, occasionally flinging an arm toward the screen to illustrate her point. Her words seemed to be falling behind as her mind raced on ahead. Charlie had realized by the second day of classes that her professor sometimes broke off in the middle of one sentence, only to finish an entirely different one. It was like she skimmed the text in her head, reading out a few words here and there. Most of the students in her robotics class found it maddening, but Charlie liked it. It made the lesson kind of like doing a puzzle. The screen flashed again, displaying an assortment of mechanical parts and a diagram of an eye. This is what you must recreate. Dr. Treadwell stepped back from the image, turning to look at it with the class. Basic artificial intelligence is all about sensory control. You won't be dealing with a mind that can filter these things out for itself. You must design programs that recognize basic shapes while discarding unimportant information. You must do for your robot what your own mind does for you. Create a simplified and organized assembly of information based on what's relevant. Let's start by looking at some examples of basic shape recognition. Charlie! Hissed the voice again, and she waved her pencil impatiently at the figure peering over her shoulder, her friend Arty, trying to shoo him away. The gesture cost her a moment, put her half a step behind the professor. She hurried to catch up, anxious not to miss a single line. The paper in front of her was covered in formulas, notes in the margins, sketches, and diagrams. She wanted to get everything down all at once, not just the math, but all the things it made her think of. If she could tie the new facts to things she already knew, she'd retain it much more easily. She felt hungry for it, alert, watching for new tidbits of information like a dog under the dinner table. A boy near the front raised his hand to ask a question, and Charlie felt a brief flare of impatience. Now the whole class would have to stop while Treadwell went back to explain a simple concept. Charlie let her mind wander, sketching absently in the margins of her notebook. John would be here in... She glanced restlessly at her watch. An hour. I told him maybe someday we'll see each other again. I guess it's someday. He had called out of the blue. I'm just going to be passing through, he said, and Charlie hadn't bothered to ask how he knew where she was. Of course he would know. There was no reason not to meet him, and she found herself alternately excited and filled with dread. Now, as she absently sketched rectangular forms along the bottom of her notepaper, her stomach jumped, a little spasm of nerves. It felt like a lifetime since she last saw him. Sometimes it felt like she'd seen him yesterday, as if the last year hadn't passed. But of course it had, and everything had changed for Charlie once again. That May, the night of her 18th birthday, the dreams had begun. Charlie was long accustomed to nightmares, the worst moments of her past forced up like bile into twisted versions of memories already too terrible to recall. She shoved these dreams into the back of her mind in the morning and sealed them away, knowing they would only breach it when night fell again. These dreams were different. When she woke, she was physically exhausted, not just drained but sore, her muscles weak. Her hands were stiff and aching, like they'd been clenched into fists for hours. These new dreams didn't come every night, but when they did, they interrupted her regular nightmares and took them over. It didn't matter if she was running and screaming for her life, or wandering aimlessly through a dull mishmash of the various places she'd been all week. Suddenly, from nowhere, she would sense him. Sammy, her lost twin brother, was near. She knew he was present the same way she knew that she was present, and whatever the dream was, it dropped away. People, places, light, and sound. Now she was searching for him in the darkness, calling his name. He never answered. She would drop to her hands and knees, feeling her way through the dark, letting his presence guide her until she came to a barrier. It was smooth and cold, metal. She couldn't see it, but she hit it hard with one fist and it echoed. "Sammy?" she would call, hitting harder. She stood, reaching up to see if she could scale the slick surface, but it stretched up far above her head. She beat her fists against the barricade until they hurt. She screamed her brother's name until her throat was raw, until she fell to the floor and leaned on the solid metal, pressing her cheek to its cool surface and hoping for a whisper from the other side. He was there. She knew it as surely as if he were a part of herself. She knew in those dreams that he was present. Worse, when she was awake, she knew he was not there. In August, Charlie and Aunt Jen had their first fight. They'd always been too distant to really argue. Charlie never felt the need to rebel, because Jen provided no real authority. And Jen never took anything Charlie did personally, never tried to stop her from doing anything, as long as she was safe. The day Charlie moved in with her at the age of 7, Aunt Jen had told her plainly that she was not a replacement for Charlie's parents. By now, Charlie was old enough to understand that Jen had meant it as a gesture of respect, a way to reassure Charlie that her father wouldn't be forgotten, that she would always be his child. but at the time it had seemed like an admonishment. Don't expect parenting. Don't expect love. And so Charlie hadn't. Jen had never failed to care for Charlie. Charlie had never wanted for food or clothing, and Jen had taught her to cook, to take care of the house, to manage her money, and to fix her own car. You have to be independent, Charlie. You have to know how to take care of yourself. You have to be stronger than... She'd cut herself off, but Charlie knew how the sentence ended. Than your father. Charlie shook her head, trying to jerk herself free of her own thoughts. What's wrong? Arty said next to her. Nothing, she whispered. She ran her pencil again and again over the same lines. Up, over, down, over. The graphite wearing thicker and thicker. Charlie had told Jen that she was going back to Hurricane, and Jen's face turned stony, her skin paling. Why would you want to do that? She asked with a dangerous calm in her voice. Charlie's heart beat faster. Because that's where I lost him. Because I need him more than I need you. The thought of returning had been nagging at her for months, growing stronger with each passing week. One morning she awoke, and the choice was made, final, sitting in her mind with a solid weight. Jessica's going to college at St. George, she told her aunt. She's starting the summer semester, so I can stay with her while I'm there. I want to see the house again. There's still so much I don't understand. It just feels... important, she finished weakly, faltering as Jen's eyes, dark blue like marble, fixed on her. Jen didn't answer for a long moment. Then she said simply, No. Why not? Charlie might once have said. You let me go before. But after what happened last year, when she and Jessica and the others went back to Freddy's and discovered the horrifying truth behind the murders at her father's old pizzeria, things had changed between them. Charlie had changed. Now she met Jen's gaze, determined. I'm going, she said, trying to keep her own voice steady. Then everything exploded. Charlie didn't know which of them started shouting first, but she screamed until her throat was fiery and sore, hurling at her aunt every pain she'd ever inflicted, every hurt she had failed to prevent. Jen shouted back that she only ever meant to care for Charlie, that she had always done her best, flinging reassuring words that somehow dripped with poison. I'm leaving! Charlie screamed with finality. She started for the door, but Jen grabbed her arm, yanking her violently back. Charlie stumbled, almost falling before she caught herself on the kitchen table, and Jen let her hand drop with a shocked expression. There was silence, and then Charlie left. She packed a bag, feeling as if she had somehow diverged from reality, into an impossible parallel world. Then she got in her car and drove away. She didn't tell anyone she was going. Her friends here were not close friends. There was no one she owed an explanation. When Charlie got to Hurricane, she'd intended to go straight to her father's house, to stay there for the next few days until Jessica arrived on campus. But as she reached the city limits, something stopped her. I can't, she thought. I can't ever go back. She turned the car around, drove straight to St. George, and slept in her car for a week. It was only after Charlie knocked, and Jessica opened the door with a startled expression, that Charlie realized that she'd never actually mentioned her plans to Jessica, on whom they all depended. She told her everything, and Jessica, hesitantly, offered to let her stay. Charlie had slept on the floor the rest of the summer, and as the fall semester approached, Jessica didn't ask her to leave. It's nice to have someone who knows me here, she had said, and uncharacteristically, Charlie hugged her. Charlie had never cared about high school. She never paid much attention in her classes, but A's and B's came easily for her. She had never really thought about liking or disliking her subjects, though sometimes one teacher or another would make her feel a spark of interest for a year. Charlie hadn't thought much beyond the end of summer, but as she idly flipped through Jessica's course catalog and saw advanced courses in robotics, something clicked into place. St. George was among the colleges she'd been accepted into earlier that year, though she hadn't really intended to go to any of them. Now, however, she went to the administrative office and pleaded her case until she was allowed to enroll, despite having missed the deadline by months. There's still so much I don't understand. Charlie wanted to learn, and the things she wanted to learn were very specific. Of course, there were things she had to learn before a robotics course would make any sense at all. Math had always been straightforward, functional, sort of like a game to Charlie. You did the thing you were supposed to do and got the answer, but it had never been a very interesting game. It was fun to learn something new, but then you had to keep doing it for weeks or months, bored out of your skull. That was high school. But in her first calculus class, something had happened. It was as if she'd been laying bricks for years, forced to work slowly, seeing nothing but her mortar and her trowel. Then suddenly someone pulled her back a few steps and said, "Here, look, you've been building this castle. Go play inside." "And that's all for today," Professor Treadwell said at last. Charlie looked down at her paper, realizing she'd never stopped moving her pencil. She had worn dark lines right through the page and drawn on the desk. She rubbed the marks half-heartedly with her sleeve, then opened her binder to put away her notes. Arty poked his head over her shoulder, and she closed it hastily, but he had already gotten a good look. "What is that? A secret code? Abstract art?" "It's just math," Charlie said a little curtly, and put the notebook in her bag. Arty was cute in a goofy way. He had a pleasant face, dark eyes, and curly brown hair that seemed to have a life of its own. He was in 3 of her 4 classes, and had been following her around since the beginning of the semester like a strayed duckling. To her surprise, Charlie found that she didn't mind it. As Charlie left the auditorium, Arty took up his now accustomed place at her side. "So, did you decide about the project?" he asked. "Project?" Charlie vaguely remembered something about a project he wanted to do together. He gave a little nod, waiting for her to catch up. "Remember? We have to design an experiment for chem. I thought we could work together, you know, with your brains and my looks." He trailed off, grinning. "Yeah, that sounds... I have to go meet someone," she interrupted herself. "You never meet anyone," he said, surprised, blushing bright red as soon as the words were out of his mouth. "I didn't mean it that way. Not that it's any of my business, but who is it?" He gave a broad smile. "John," Charlie said without elaboration. Arty looked crestfallen for a moment, but recovered quickly. "Of course, yeah, John, great guy," he said teasingly. He raised his eyebrows, prompting for details, but she gave none. "I didn't know you were... that you had a... That's cool." Arty's face took on a look of careful neutrality. Charlie looked at him oddly. She hadn't meant to imply that she and John were a couple, but she didn't know how to correct him. She couldn't explain who John was to her without telling Arty far more than she wanted him to know. They walked in silence for a minute across the main quad, a small grassy square surrounded by brick and concrete buildings. "So, is John from your hometown?" Arty asked at last. "My hometown is 30 minutes away. This place is basically just an extension of it," Charlie said. "But yeah, he's from Hurricane." Arty hesitated, then leaned in closer to her, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "I always meant to ask you," he said. Charlie looked at him wearily. "Don't ask about it." "I'm sure people ask you about it all the time, but come on, you can't blame me for being curious. That stuff about the murders, it's like an urban legend around here. I mean, not just around here, everywhere. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza." "Stop." Charlie's face was suddenly immobile. She felt as if moving it, making any expression at all, would require an arcane skill she no longer possessed. Arty's face had changed, too. His easy smile drained away. He looked almost frightened. Charlie bit the inside of her lip, willing her mouth to move. "I was just a kid when all that happened," she said quietly. Arty nodded, quick and skittish. Charlie made her face move into a smile. "I have to go meet Jessica," she lied. "I have to get away from you." Arty nodded his head again like a bobblehead doll. She turned and walked away toward the dorm, not looking back. Charlie blinked into the sunlight. Flashes of what happened last year at Freddy's were batting at her, snatches of memory plucking at her clothing with cold, iron fingers. The hook above, poised to strike. No escape. A figure looming behind the stage. Red matted fur barely concealing the metal bones of the murderous creature. Kneeling in pitch dark on the cold tile floor of the bathroom. And then, that giant, hard plastic eye glaring through the crack. The hot miasma of lifeless breath on her face. And the other, older memory. The thought that made her ache in ways for which she had no words. Sorrow filling her as if it had been wrought into her very bones. She and Sammy, her other self, her twin brother, were playing their quiet games in the familiar warmth of the costume closet. Then the figure appeared in the doorway, looking down on them. Then Sammy was gone, and the world ended for the first time. Charlie was standing outside her own dorm room, almost without knowing how she'd gotten there. Slowly, she pulled her keys from her pocket and let herself into the room. The lights were off. Jessica was still in class. Charlie shut the door behind her, checking the lock twice, and leaned back against it. She took a deep breath. It's over now. She straightened decisively and snapped on the overhead light, filling the room with a harsh illumination. The clock beside the bed told Charlie that she still had a little under an hour before John arrived. Time to work on her project. Charlie and Jessica had divided the room with a piece of masking tape after their first week living together. Jessica suggested it jokingly, said she'd seen it in a movie, but Charlie had grinned and helped her measure the room. She knew Jessica was desperate to keep Charlie's mess off her side. The result was a bedroom that looked like a before and after picture, advertising either a cleaning service or a nuclear weapon, depending on whose side you looked at first. On Charlie's desk there was a pillowcase, draped over two indistinct shapes. She went to her desk and removed it, folding it carefully and placing it on her chair. She looked at her project. "Hello," she said softly. Two mechanical faces were held upright on metal structures and attached to a length of board. Their features were indistinct, like old statues worn away by rain, or new clay not yet fully sculpted. They were made of a malleable plastic, and where the backs of their heads ought to be, there were instead networks of casings, microchips, and wires. Charlie bent down toward them, looking over every millimeter of her design, making sure everything was as she'd left it. She flipped a small black switch and little lights blinked. Tiny cooling fans began to whir. They didn't move right away, but there was a change. The vague features took on a sense of purpose. Their blind eyes didn't turn to Charlie. They looked only at each other. "You," said the first. Its lips moved to shape the syllable, but never parted. They weren't made to open. "I," the second replied, making the same soft, constrained movement. "You are," said the first. "Am I?" said the second. Charlie watched, her hand pressed over her mouth. She held her breath, afraid of disturbing them. She waited, but they had apparently finished, and were now simply looking at each other. "They can't see," Charlie reminded herself. She turned them off and pulled the board around so that she could peer into their backs. She reached inside and adjusted a wire. A key slid into the lock of the door, and Charlie startled at the sound. She snatched the pillowcase and threw it over the faces as Jessica entered the room. Jessica paused in the doorway with a grin. "What was that?" she asked. "What?" Charlie said innocently. "Come on, I know you were working on that thing you never let me see." She dropped her backpack on the floor, then flopped dramatically back on the bed. "Anyways, I'm exhausted," she announced. Charlie laughed, and Jessica sat up. "Come talk to me," she said. "What's up with you and John?" Charlie sat down on her own bed, across from Jessica. Despite their different lifestyles, she liked living with the other girl. Jessica was warm and bright, and while her ease as she went about the world still intimidated Charlie a little, now she felt like a part of it. Maybe being Jessica's friend meant absorbing some of her confidence. "I haven't seen him yet. I have to leave in..." She peered over Jessica's shoulder at the clock. 15 minutes. "Are you excited?" Jessica asked. Charlie shrugged. "I think so," she said. Jessica laughed. "You're not sure?" "I'm excited," Charlie admitted. "It's just been a long time." "Not that long," Jessica pointed out. Then she looked thoughtful. "I guess it sort of has been, though. Everything is so different since the last time we saw him." Charlie cleared her throat. "So you really want to see my project?" she asked, surprising herself. "Yes," Jessica declared, springing up from the bed. She followed Charlie to her desk. Charlie switched on the power, then flung off the pillowcase like a magician. Jessica gasped and took an involuntary step back. "What is it?" she asked, her voice cautious. But before Charlie could answer, the first face spoke. "Me," it said. "You," the other replied, and they both fell silent again. Charlie looked at Jessica. Her friend had a pinched expression, like she was holding something tightly inside. "I," the second face said. Charlie hurried to switch them off. "Why do you have that look on your face?" she said. Jessica took a deep breath and smiled at her. "I just haven't had lunch yet," she said, but something lingered in her eyes. Jessica watched as Charlie replaced the pillowcase lovingly over the faces, as if she were tucking a child into bed. She looked uncomfortably around the room. Charlie's half was a disaster. Clothes and books were strewn everywhere, but there were also the wires and computer parts, tools, screws, and pieces of plastic and metal Jessica didn't recognize, all jumbled up together. It wasn't just a mess. It was a chaotic tangle where you could lose anything. Or hide anything, she realized, with a pang of guilt at the thought. Jessica turned her attention back to Charlie. "What are you programming them to do?" she asked, and Charlie smiled proudly. "I'm not exactly programming them to do anything. I'm helping them learn on their own." "Right, of course. Obviously," Jessica said slowly. As she did, something caught her eye. A pair of shiny plastic eyes and long floppy ears were peering out from a pile of dirty laundry. "Hey, I never noticed you brought Theodore, your little robo-rabbit," she exclaimed, pleased to have remembered the name of Charlie's childhood toy. Before Charlie could respond, she picked the stuffed animal up by his ears and came away with only his head. Jessica let out a shriek and dropped it, clapping a hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry," Charlie said, hastily grabbing the rabbit's head off the floor. "I took him apart to study. I'm using some of his parts in my project." She gestured at the thing on her desk. "Oh," Jessica said, trying to hide her dismay. She glanced around the room and suddenly realized that the rabbit's parts were everywhere. His cotton ball tail was on Charlie's pillow, and a leg hung off the lamp above her desk. His torso lay in the corner, almost out of sight, ripped open savagely. Jessica looked at her friend's round, cheerful face and frizzy, shoulder-length brown hair. Jessica closed her eyes for a long moment. "Oh, Charlie, what's wrong with you?" "Jessica?" Charlie said. The girl's eyes were closed, her expression pained. "Jessica?" This time she opened her eyes and gave Charlie a sudden, bright smile, turning on cheer like a faucet. It was disconcerting, but Charlie had gotten used to it. Jessica blinked hard, like she was resetting her brain. "So, are you nervous about seeing John?" she asked. Charlie thought for a moment. "No. I mean, why should I be? It's just John, right?" Charlie tried to laugh, but gave up. "Jessica, I don't know what to talk about," she burst out suddenly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know what to talk about with him," Charlie said. "If we don't have something to talk about, then we'll start talking about what happened last year, and I just can't." "Right." Jessica looked thoughtful. "Maybe he won't bring it up," she offered. Charlie sighed, glancing back at her covered experiment with longing. "Of course he will. It's all we have in common." She sat down heavily on her bed and slumped over. "Charlie, you don't have to talk about anything you don't want to talk about," Jessica said gently. "You can always just cancel on him. But I don't think John's going to put you on the spot. He cares about you. I doubt what happened in Hurricane is what's on his mind." "What does that mean?" "I just mean..." Jessica gingerly pushed aside a pile of laundry and sat next to Charlie, placing a hand on her knee. "I just mean that maybe it's time that you both move past that. And I think John is trying to." Charlie looked away and stared fixedly at Theodore's head, face down on the floor. "You mean, get over it? How do I even begin?" Jessica's voice softened. "This can't be your whole life anymore." "I know." Charlie sighed. She decided to change the subject. "How was your class anyway?" Charlie wiped her eyes, hoping Jessica would take the hint. "Awesome." Jessica stood and stretched, bending over to touch her toes and incidentally giving Charlie a chance to compose herself. When Jessica stood again, she was smiling brilliantly, back in character. "Did you know that corpses can be preserved in peat bogs like mummies?" Charlie wrinkled her nose. "I do now. So is that what you're going to do when you graduate? Crawl around in peat bogs looking for bodies?" Jessica shrugged. "Maybe." "I'll get you a hazmat suit for your graduation gift," Charlie joked. She looked at her watch. "Time to go. Wish me luck." She brushed her hair back with her hands, peering into the mirror that hung on the back of the door. "I feel like a mess." "You look great." Jessica gave her an encouraging nod. "I've been doing sit-ups," Charlie said awkwardly. "Huh?" "Forget it." Charlie grabbed her backpack and headed for the door. "Go knock his socks off," Jessica called as Charlie left. "I don't know what that means," Charlie replied, letting the door swing closed before she'd finished speaking. Charlie spotted him as she approached the main entrance to the campus. John was leaning on the wall, reading a book. His brown hair was as messy as ever, and he was wearing a blue t-shirt and jeans, dressed more casually than the last time she'd seen him. "John," she called, her reluctance falling away as soon as she saw him. He put away his book, grinning widely, and hurried to her. "Hey, Charlie," he said. They stood there awkwardly, then Charlie extended her arms to hug him. He held her tightly for a moment, then abruptly released her. "You got taller," she said accusingly, and he laughed. "I did," he admitted. He gave her a searching look. "You look exactly the same, though," he said with a puzzled smile. "I cut my hair," Charlie said in mock outrage. She ran her fingers through it, demonstrating. "Oh, yeah," he said. "I like it. I just mean, you're the same girl I remember." "I've been doing sit-ups," Charlie said with a rising panic. "Huh?" John gave her a confused look. "Never mind. Are you hungry?" Charlie asked. "I have about an hour before my next class. We could get a burger. There's a dining hall not far from here." "Yeah, that would be great," John said. Charlie pointed across the quad. "That way. Come on." "So, what are you doing here?" Charlie asked as they sat down with their trays. "Sorry," she added. "Did that sound rude?" "Not rude at all, although I would have also accepted. John, to what circumstance do I owe the pleasure of this delightful reunion?" "Yeah, that sounds like me," Charlie said dryly. "But seriously, what are you doing here?" "Got a job." "In St. George?" she asked. "Why?" "In Hurricane, actually," he said, his voice self-consciously casual. "Aren't you in school somewhere?" Charlie asked. John blushed, looking down at his plate for a moment. "I was going to, but it's a lot of money to read books when a library card is free, you know? My cousin got me a job in construction, and I'm working on my writing when I can. I figured even if I'm gonna be an artist, I don't have to be a starving one." He took an illustrative bite of his hamburger, and Charlie grinned. "So, why here?" she insisted, and he held up a finger as he finished chewing. "The storm," he said. Charlie nodded. The storm had hit Hurricane before Charlie came to St. George, and people talked about it in capital letters. The storm. It wasn't the worst the area had ever seen, but it was close. A tornado had risen up from nowhere and ripped through whole towns, razing one house to the ground with sinister precision, while leaving the one next to it untouched. There hadn't been much damage in St. George, but Hurricane had seen real destruction. "How bad is it?" Charlie asked, keeping her tone light. "You haven't been?" John said incredulously, and it was Charlie's turn to look awkwardly away. She shook her head. "It's bad in places," he said, "mostly on the outskirts of town. Charlie, I assumed you'd been." He bit his lip. "What?" Something about his expression was worrying her. "Your dad's house. It was one of the ones that got hit," he said. "Oh." Something leaden was growing in Charlie's chest. "I didn't know." "You really didn't even go back to check?" "I didn't think of it," Charlie said. That's not true. She'd thought 1,000 times of going back to her father's house, but it had never occurred to her that the house might have been hit in the storm. In her mind, it was impregnable, unchanging. It would always be there, just as her father had left it. She closed her eyes and pictured it. The front steps sagged in disrepair, but the house itself stood like a fortress, protecting what was inside. "Is it gone?" Charlie asked, the words faint. No, John said quickly. No, it's still there, just damaged. I don't know how much. I just drove by. I didn't think I should go there without you. Charlie nodded, only half listening. She felt far away. She could see John, hear him, but there was a layer of something between them, between her and everything else, everything but the house itself. I would have thought... Didn't your aunt tell you what happened? John asked. I have to get to class, Charlie said. It's that way. She gestured vaguely. Charlie, have you been okay? She didn't look at him, and he placed his hand over hers. She still couldn't look up. She didn't want him to see her face. Okay, she repeated, then slipped her hand out from under his and shrugged her shoulders up and down, like she was trying to get something off her back. I had my birthday, she offered, and she finally leveled her gaze to meet his. I'm sorry I missed it, John said. No, that's not... She tipped her head from side to side, as if she could level out her thoughts, too. Do you remember how I had a twin? What? John sounded puzzled. Of course I do. I'm sorry, Charlie. Is that what you meant about your birthday? She nodded, making tiny motions. John held out his hand again, and she took it. She could feel his pulse through his thumb. Ever since we left Hurricane, you know how twins are supposed to be connected, have some kind of special bond? Sure, he said. Ever since we left, ever since I found out he was real, I felt like he was there with me. I know he's not. He's dead, but for that whole year, I didn't feel alone anymore. Charlie. John's hand tightened on hers. You know you're not alone. No, I mean really not alone. Like I have another self. Someone who's a part of me and is always with me. I've had these feelings before, but they came and went, and I didn't pay much attention to them. I didn't know they meant something. Then when I learned the truth, and those memories started coming back to me, John, I felt whole in a way I don't even know how to describe. Her eyes began to fill with tears, and she pulled her hand back to brush them away. Hey, he said softly. It's okay. That's great, Charlie. I'm glad you have that. No, that's the thing. I don't. She met his eyes, desperate for him to understand what she was so awkwardly trying to say. He's disappeared. That sense of completeness is gone. What? It happened on my birthday. I woke up and I just felt... She sighed, searching. There wasn't a word for it. Alone? John said. Incomplete. She took a deep breath, pulling herself back together. But the thing is, it's not just loss. It's like he's trapped somewhere. I have these dreams where I can feel him on the other side of something. Like he's so close to me, but he's stuck somewhere. Like he's in a box, or I'm in a box. I can't tell. John stared at her, momentarily speechless. Before he could figure out what to say, Charlie stood abruptly. I need to leave. Are you sure? You haven't even eaten, he said. I'm sorry. She broke off. John, it's so good to see you. She hesitated, then turned to walk away, possibly for good. She knew she'd disappointed him. Charlie, would you like to go out with me tonight? John's voice sounded stiff, but his eyes were warm. Sure, that would be great, she said, giving a half smile. Don't you have to get back to work tomorrow, though? It's only a half an hour away, John said. He cleared his throat. But I meant, do you want to go out with me? I just said yeah, Charlie repeated, slightly irritated. John sighed. I mean on a date, Charlie. Oh. Charlie stared at him for a moment. Right. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Jessica's voice echoed in her head. And yet, she realized she was smiling. Yes. Yes, a date. Okay, yeah, there's a movie theater in town? She hazarded, vaguely recalling that movies were something people did on dates. John nodded vigorously, apparently as lost at sea as she was, now that the question had been asked. Can we have dinner first? There's that Thai place down the street. I can meet you there around 8. Yeah, sounds good. Bye. Charlie grabbed her backpack and hurried out the dining room door, realizing as she stepped into the sunshine that she'd left him to clean up their table alone. Sorry. As Charlie headed across the quad to her next class, her step grew more purposeful. This was a basic computer science class. Writing code wasn't as exciting as what Dr. Treadwell taught, but Charlie still liked it. It was absorbing, detailed work. A single error could ruin everything. Everything? She thought of her impending date. The idea that a single error could ruin everything suddenly carried an awful weight. Charlie hurried up the steps to the building and stopped short as a man blocked her path. It was Clay Burke. Hey, Charlie. He smiled, but his eyes were grave. Charlie hadn't seen Hurricane's chief of police, her friend Carlton's father, since the night they'd escaped Freddy's together. Looking now at his weathered face, she felt a rush of fear. Mr. Burke, Clay, what are you doing here? Charlie, do you have a second? He asked. Her heart sped up. Is Carlton okay? She asked urgently. Yes, he's fine, Burke assured her. Walk with me. Don't worry about being late. I'll give you a note for class. At least, I think an officer of the law has authority to do that. He winked, but Charlie didn't smile. Something was wrong. Charlie followed him back down the stairs. When they were a dozen feet from the building, Burke stopped and met her gaze, as if he were looking for something. Charlie, we've found a body, he said. I want you to take a look at it. You want me to look at it? I need you to see it. Me. She said the only thing she could. Why? Does it have to do with Freddy's? I don't want to tell you anything until you've seen it, Burke said. He started walking again, and Charlie hurried to keep up with his long stride. She followed him to the parking lot just outside the main gate, and got into his car without a word. Charlie settled into her seat, a strange dread stirring within her. Clay Burke glanced at her, and she gave a sharp, quick nod. He pulled the car out onto the road, and they headed back to Hurricane. Chapter 2. So, how are you enjoying your classes? Clay Burke asked in a jovial tone. Charlie gave him a sardonic look. Well, this is the first murder of the semester, so things have been going fine. Burke didn't answer, apparently aware that further attempts to lighten the mood would fail. Charlie looked out the window. She thought often of going back to her father's house, but each time the memory of the place rose up, she slammed it back down with almost physical force, cramming it into the tiny corners of her mind to gather dust. Now something was stirring in the dusty corners, and she feared she might not be able to keep it away much longer. Chief Burke? Clay, Charlie said. How's Carlton been? He smiled. Carlton's doing great. I tried to convince him to stay close for college, but he and Betty were adamant. Now he's out east, studying acting. Acting? Charlie laughed, surprising herself. Well, he was always a prankster, Clay said. I figured acting was the next logical step. Charlie smiled. Did he ever... She looked out the window again. Did you and he ever talk about what happened? She asked with her face turned away. She could see Clay's reflection faintly in the window, distorted by the glass. Carlton talks to his mother more than he talks to me, he said plainly. Charlie waited for him to go on, but he remained silent. Though she and Jessica lived together, from the beginning they had an unspoken pact never to talk about Freddy's, except in the barest terms. She didn't know if Jessica was sometimes consumed by the memories, as she was. Maybe Jessica had nightmares too. But Charlie and Clay had no such pact. She took in shallow, quick breaths, waiting to hear how far he would go. I think Carlton had dreams about it, Clay said finally. Sometimes in the morning he would come downstairs looking like he hadn't slept in a week, but he never told me what was going on. What about you? Do you think about it? She was overstepping, but Clay didn't seem ruffled. I try not to, he said gravely. You know, Charlie, when terrible things happen, you can do one of two things. You can leave them behind, or you can let them consume you. Charlie set her jaw. I'm not my father, she said. Clay looked immediately contrite. I know, I didn't mean that, he said. I just meant you have to look forward. He flashed a nervous grin. Of course, my wife would say there's a third thing. You can process the terrible things and come to terms with them. She's probably right. Probably, Charlie said distractedly. And what about you? How are you doing, Charlie? Clay asked. It was the question she had practically solicited, but she didn't know how to answer it. I have dreams about it, I guess, she muttered. You guess? He asked in a careful tone. What kind of dreams? Charlie looked out the window again. There was a weight pressing on her chest. What kind of dreams? Nightmares, but not of Freddy's. A shadow in the doorway of the costume closet where we play. Sammy doesn't see. He's playing with his truck. But I look up. The shadow has eyes. Then everything is moving. Hangers rattle and costumes sway. A toy truck drops hard on the floor. I'm left alone. The air is growing thin. I'm running out. It's getting hard to breathe, and I'll die like this, alone, in the dark. I pound against the closet wall, calling for help. I know he's there. Sammy is on the other side, but he doesn't answer my cries as I begin to gasp, choking for air. It is too dark to see, but even so, I know my vision is going black, and in my chest my heart is slowing, each pump swelling me with pain, as I struggled to call his name one more time. Charlie? Clay had pulled over and stopped the car without her noticing. Now he was looking at her with his piercing detective's gaze. She looked at him for a moment before she could remember how to answer, and she made herself smile. I've mostly been focused on school, she said. Clay smiled at her, but it didn't touch his eyes. He looked worried. He's wishing he hadn't brought me, she thought. He opened his door but didn't get out of the car. The sun had begun to set as they drove, and now it was verging on dark. The turn signal was still on, flashing yellow onto the dirt road. Charlie watched it for a moment, hypnotized. She felt as if she might never move again, just sit here watching the endless, measured blinking of the light. Clay switched the signal off, and Charlie blinked, as if a spell had been broken. She straightened her spine and unbuckled her seatbelt. Charlie, Clay said, not looking directly at her. "I'm sorry to ask this of you, but you're the only person who can tell me if this is what I think it is." "Okay," she replied, suddenly alert. Clay sighed and got out of the car. Charlie followed close behind him. There was a barbed wire fence all along the road, and there were cows in the field beyond it. They stood around, chewing and staring in the vacant way of cows. Clay lifted the top wire for Charlie, and she climbed gingerly through. "When's the last time I got a tetanus shot?" she wondered, as a barb caught briefly on her t-shirt. She didn't have to ask where the body was. There was a floodlight and a makeshift fence of caution tape strung between posts that jutted from the soil in a scattered formation. Charlie stood where she was as Burke climbed through the fence after her, and they both surveyed the area. The field was flat, and the grass was short and patchy, worn down daily by dozens of hooves. A single tree stood some distance from where the crime scene was marked. Charlie thought it was an oak. Its branches were long and ancient, heavy with leaves. There was something wrong with the air. Along with the smell of cow dung and mud, wafted the sharp, metallic scent of blood. For some reason, Charlie looked at the cows again. They weren't as calm as she'd assumed. They shifted back and forth on their feet, clustering in groups. None of them came anywhere near the floodlight. As if sensing her scrutiny, one of them lowed a mournful cry. Charlie heard Clay's sharp intake of breath. "Maybe we should ask them what happened," Charlie said. In the stillness, her voice carried. Clay started toward the floodlight. Charlie followed closely, not wanting to fall too far behind. It wasn't just the cows. A weight of something wrong hung over the place. There was no sound, only the shocked quiet that follows a terrible violence. Clay stopped beside the marked-out spot and ushered Charlie forward, still saying nothing. Charlie looked. It was a man, stretched in a ghastly posture on his back, his limbs contorted impossibly. In the glaring, unnatural light, the scene looked staged. He might have been an enormous doll. His whole body was drenched red with blood. His clothes were torn, almost shredded, and through the holes Charlie thought she could see ripped-up skin, some bone, and other things she couldn't identify. "What do you make of it?" Clay said softly, as if he were afraid of disturbing her. "I need to get closer," she said. Clay climbed over the yellow tape, and Charlie followed. She knelt in the mud beside the man's head, the knees of her jeans soaking with mud. He was middle-aged, white, his hair short and gray. His eyes, thankfully, were closed. The rest of his face slack in a way that could almost have looked like sleep, but did not. She leaned forward to peer at the man's neck and blanched, but didn't look away. "Charlie, are you all right?" Clay asked, and she held up a hand. "I'm fine." She knew those wounds. She'd seen the scars they left. On each side of the dead man's neck was a deep, curved gash. This was what had killed him. It would have been instantaneous. Or maybe not. Suddenly she pictured Dave, the guard at Freddy's, the murderer. She had watched him die. She'd triggered the spring locks and seen his startled eyes as the locks drove into his neck. She'd watched his body jolt and seize as the costume he wore shot jagged metal through his vital organs. Charlie stared at this stranger's wounds. She reached down and ran her finger along the edge of the cut on the man's neck. "What were you doing?" "Charlie!" Clay said in alarm, and Charlie drew back her hand. "Sorry," she said self-consciously, wiping her bloody fingers on her jeans. "Clay, it was one of them. His neck, he died like..." She stopped talking. Clay had been there. His son had almost died the same way. But if this was happening again, he had to know what he was dealing with. "You remember how Dave died, right?" she asked. Clay nodded. "Hard thing to forget." He shook his head, patiently waiting for her to get to the point. "These suits, like the rabbit suit that Dave was wearing, they can be worn like costumes, or they can move around on their own as fully functional robots." "Sure, you just put the suit on a robot," Clay said. "Not exactly. The robots are always inside the suits. They're made of interlocking parts that are held back against the inner lining of the costumes by spring locks. When you want an animatronic, you just trip the locks, and the robotic parts unfold inside, filling the suit." "But if there's someone inside the suit when the locks are tripped," Clay said, catching on. "Right. Thousands of sharp metal parts shoot through your whole body. Like, well, that," she finished, gesturing at the man on the ground. "How hard is it to accidentally trigger the spring locks?" Clay asked. "It depends on the costume. If it's well cared for, pretty hard. If it's old or poorly designed, it could happen. And if it's not an accident." "Is that what happened here?" Charlie hesitated. Dave's image came to her again, this time alive, when he bared his torso to show them the scars he bore. Dave had once survived being crushed like this, though the second time had killed him. Somehow he had survived the lethal unfolding of a costume, a thing that should have been impossible, but it had left its marks. She cleared her throat and started again. "I need to see his chest," she said. "Can you get his shirt off?" Clay nodded and took a pair of plastic gloves from his pocket. He tossed them to Charlie, but they fell to the ground unnoticed. "If I'd known you were going to stick your fingers in the corpse, I'd have given these to you earlier," he said dryly. He put on a pair of his own and produced a knife from somewhere on his belt. The man was wearing a t-shirt. Clay dropped to his knees, took hold of the bottom, and began to saw through the cloth. The sound of wet, tearing fabric cut through the silent field like a cry of pain. At last he was done, and he pulled back the shirt. Dried blood clung to the fabric, and as Clay pulled it back, the body pulled with it, giving a brief, false sense of life. Charlie bent over, picturing Dave's scars. She compared the pattern to the wounds she saw here. This is what happened to Dave. Each piercing of the man's flesh seemed like a killing blow. Any one of them might have punctured something vital, or simply been deep enough to drain him of blood in minutes. What was left of him was grotesque. "It was one of them," Charlie said, looking up at Clay for the first time since they reached the body. "He must have been wearing one of the costumes. It's the only way he could end up like this. But..." Charlie paused and scanned the field again. "Where's the suit?" "What would someone be doing wearing one of those things out here?" Clay said. "Maybe he wasn't wearing it willingly," Charlie answered. Clay leaned forward and reached for the man's open shirt, pulling it closed as best he could. Together they got up and headed back to the car. As Clay drove her back to campus, Charlie stared out the window into the darkness. "Clay, what happened to Freddy's?" she asked. "I hear it was torn down." She scratched her fingernail on the car seat nervously. "Is that true?" "Yes. Well, they started to," Clay said slowly. "We went through the whole place, clearing everything out. It was a funny thing. We couldn't find the body of that guard, Dave." He paused and looked directly at Charlie, as though expecting her to answer for something. Charlie felt the warmth drain from her face. "He's dead. I saw him die." She closed her eyes for a moment and forced herself to focus. That place was like a maze, though. Clay turned his eyes casually back to the road. His body probably got stuffed into some crevice no one will find for years. Yeah, probably buried in the rubble. She looked down, trying to put the thought out of her head for the moment. What about the costumes? The robots? Clay hesitated. You must have known I would ask, Charlie thought with some annoyance. Everything we took out of Freddy's was thrown away or burned. Technically, I should have treated it like what it was. A break in the missing kids case, over a decade old. Everything would have been bagged up and gone over. But no one would have believed what happened there, what we saw. So I took some liberties. He glanced at Charlie, the suspicious look gone from his face, and she nodded for him to continue. Clay took a deep breath. I treated it only as the murder of my officer. You remember Officer Dunn. We recovered his body, closed the case, and I ordered the building to be demolished. What about... Charlie paused, trying not to let her frustration show. What about Freddy, and Bonnie, and Chica, and Foxy? What about the children who were killed and hidden inside each one of them? They were all there, Clay said gravely. They were lifeless, Charlie. I don't know what else to tell you. Charlie didn't respond. As far as the demolition crew was concerned, all they'd found were old costumes, broken robots, and 24 folding tables. And I didn't correct them, he said with hesitation in his voice. You know how these things go. Whether building up or tearing down, it takes time. From what I hear, the storm hit and suddenly everyone was needed elsewhere. The demolition was put on hold. So it's all still standing there? Charlie asked, and Clay gave her a warning look. Some parts are standing, but for all intents and purposes, it's gone. And don't even think about going back there. There's no reason to, and you'll get yourself killed. Like I said, everything that mattered is gone anyway. I don't want to go back there, Charlie said softly. When they reached the campus, Clay led her out where he'd found her. She'd only taken a few steps from the car, however, when he called to her from the car window. I feel like I need to tell you one more thing, he said. We found blood at the scene, in the main dining room where Dave... He looked around cautiously. There was something unseemly, talking about gruesome things on the sheltered grounds of the campus. It wasn't real blood, Charlie. What are you talking about? Charlie took a step back toward the car. It was like costume blood, or movie blood. It was pretty convincing, though. We didn't realize it was fake until the crime lab looked at it under a microscope. Why are you telling me this? Charlie asked, although she knew the answer. The terrible possibility was pounding in her mind like a headache. He survived once, Clay said plainly. Well, he didn't survive the second time. Charlie turned to walk away. I'm sorry you have to be involved in this, Clay called. Charlie didn't answer. She looked down at the pavement and clenched her teeth. Clay raised the window without another word and drove away. Chapter 3. Charlie checked her watch. She was on time to meet John, even early. She passed under a streetlight and looked down at herself, checking her clothes. Oh no. The knees of her jeans were wet with mud, and there was a dark stain where she had wiped her fingers clean of the dead man's blood. I can't show up covered in blood. He's seen me like this too many times already. She sighed and turned around. Thankfully, Jessica was gone when she got back to the room. Charlie didn't want to talk about what had just happened. Clay hadn't explicitly told her to keep it a secret, but she was fairly sure she shouldn't broadcast her private visit to a crime scene. Charlie cast a glance at the faces under their pillowcase cover, but didn't go to them. She wanted to show her project to John, but, like Jessica, he might not understand. She opened a dresser drawer and stared down at the contents without registering them. In her mind, she saw the body again, its limbs splayed out as if it had been thrown down where it lay. She covered her face with her hands, taking deep breaths. She had seen the scars, but she'd never seen the wounds of the spring locks fresh. Now Dave's eyes came to her, the look of shock just before he fell. Charlie could feel the locks in her hands, feel them resist, then give way and snap. That's what happened. That's what I did. She swallowed and slid her hands down to her throat. Charlie shook her head like a dog shaking off a wet coat. She looked at the open drawer again, concentrating. I need to change. What is all this? The drawer was filled with brightly colored shirts, all unfamiliar. Charlie startled, a dim panic seizing her. What is all this? She picked up a t-shirt and dropped it again, then forced herself to take a deep breath. Jessica. They're Jessica's. She'd opened the wrong drawer. Get it together, Charlie, she told herself sternly, and somehow it sounded like Aunt Jen's voice in her head. Despite everything that lay between her and her aunt, just imagining her cold, authoritative voice made Charlie a little calmer. She nodded to herself, then grabbed what she needed, a clean t-shirt and jeans. She dressed hurriedly, then left to meet John, her stomach fluttering, half excited, half sick. A date, she thought. What if it doesn't go well? Worse, what if it does? As she neared the Thai restaurant, she saw that John was already there. He was waiting outside, but he didn't look impatient. He didn't spot her right away, and Charlie slowed her pace for a moment, watching him. He seemed at ease, gazing into the middle distance with a vague, pleasant expression. He had an air of confidence he hadn't possessed a year ago. It wasn't that he'd been unsure of himself then, but now he looked adult. Maybe it was because he'd gone straight to work after high school. Maybe it was what happened last year at Freddy's, Charlie thought with an unexpected sense of envy. Although she'd moved out on her own, to a new home and a new college, she felt as if the experience had left her more a child, not less. Not a cared for or protected child, but one who was vulnerable and unmoored. A child who had looked under the bed and seen the monsters. John noticed her and waved. Charlie waved back and smiled, the expression unforced. Date or not, it was good to see him. How was your last class? He said by way of greeting, and Charlie shrugged. I don't know. It was class. How was the rest of work? He grinned. It was work. Are you hungry? Yes, Charlie said decisively. They headed inside and were motioned to a table. Have you been here before? John asked, and Charlie shook her head. I don't get out much, she said. I don't even come out to town that often. The college is sort of its own little world, you know? I can imagine, John said cheerfully. Now that the secret was out that he wasn't in school, he'd apparently shed his earlier discomfort. Isn't it a little bit... He searched for words. Doesn't it feel a little isolated? Not really, Charlie said. If it's a prison, it's not one of the worst. I didn't mean to compare it to a prison, John said. So, come on. What are you studying? Charlie hesitated. There was no reason not to tell John, but it seemed too soon, too risky to announce that she was eagerly following in her father's footsteps. She didn't want to tell him she was studying robotics until she had some idea of how he would respond, just like with her project. Most colleges make you do a set of classes your first year. English, math, everything like that, she said, hoping it would sound like a response. Suddenly, Charlie didn't want to talk about school. She wasn't sure she could keep up a conversation about anything, really. She looked at John, and for a moment imagined the spring-lock wounds in his neck. Her eyes widened and she bit the inside of her cheek, trying to ground herself. "Tell me about your job," she said, and saw her own hesitation mirrored on his face. I like the work," he said. "More than I thought I would, actually. There's something about doing physical labor that kind of frees my mind. It's like meditation. It's hard, though, really hard. Construction workers always make it look so easy, but it turns out it takes a while to build up that kind of muscle." He stretched his arms comically over his head, and Charlie laughed, but couldn't help noticing that he was clearly well on his way to that kind of muscle. John leaned to his left and gave his armpit a quick sniff, then made a look of mock embarrassment. Charlie looked down at her menu and giggled. "Do you already know what you want?" she asked. Then the waitress appeared out of nowhere, as if she'd been listening nearby. John ordered, and Charlie froze. She'd said it just to say something, but she didn't know what to get. Suddenly, she noticed all the prices. Everything on the menu was impossibly expensive. She hadn't even thought about money when she accepted John's invitation, but now her mind jumped to her wallet and her nearly empty bank account. Misreading her expression, John leaped in. "If you've never had Thai food, pad Thai is good," he suggested. "I should have asked," he said awkwardly. "If I'm buying a lady dinner, I should make sure she likes the food." He looked embarrassed, but Charlie was flooded with relief. Buying a lady dinner. "No, I'm sure I'll like it," she said. "Pad Thai, thanks," she told the waitress, then gave John a mock glare. "Who are you calling a lady?" she said playfully, and he laughed. "What's wrong with that?" "It just sounds weird, you calling me a lady," Charlie said. "So anyway, what do you do all day besides meditate?" "Well, the days are long, and like I said, I'm still writing, so there's that. It's strange being in Hurricane again, though. I didn't mean to put down roots." "Put down roots?" "Like, join a bowling team or something. Ties to the community, things like that." Charlie nodded. She, of all people, understood the need to remain apart. "Why did you take the job here, then?" she asked. "I know they needed people because of the storm, but you didn't have to come, right? People are still building things in other places." "That's true," he admitted. "To be honest, it was more about getting away from where I was." "Sounds familiar?" Charlie muttered, too softly for him to hear. The waitress returned with their food. Charlie took a quick bite of rice noodles and immediately burned her mouth. She grabbed her water glass and drank. "Yikes, that's hot," she said. "So what were you getting away from?" She asked the question casually, as if the answer would be simple. "Do you have nightmares too?" She held back the words, waiting for him to speak. John hesitated. Girl, actually," he said. He paused, searching for a reaction. Charlie stopped chewing. That wasn't at all the answer she'd been expecting. She swallowed, nodding with self-conscious enthusiasm. After an excruciating silence, John went on. "We started dating the summer after Freddy's. I told her I wasn't looking for anything serious. She said she wasn't either. Then suddenly it was 6 months later, and we were serious. I had just started working. I'd moved out on my own, and had this grown-up relationship. It was a shock, but a good one, I guess. He stopped, not sure whether he should continue. Charlie wasn't sure she wanted to give him permission. "So, tell me about her," she said calmly, avoiding eye contact. I'm not dating her, but it's not like she's dead. Her name is Rebecca. She's pretty, I guess. Smart. She's a year older than me. A college student studying English. Has a dog. So yeah, she was all right. What happened? I don't know, he said. Really? Charlie said dryly, and he smiled. No, I felt on guard around her. Like there were things I couldn't tell her. Things she'd just never understand. It wasn't because of her. She was great. But she knew I was holding something back. She just didn't know what it was. I wonder what it could have been, Charlie asked quietly. The question was rhetorical. They both knew the answer. John smiled. Well, anyway, she broke up with me, and I was devastated, blah, blah, blah. Actually, I don't think I was that devastated. John looked down, focusing on his food but not touching it. Have you ever tried to tell anyone about Freddy's? John glanced back up and pointed his fork at Charlie. She shook her head. It wasn't just what happened, he went on. I can't imagine telling that story and having her believe me, but it wasn't only that. I wanted her to know the facts of it, but more, I wanted to tell her what it did to me, how it changed me. It changed all of us, Charlie said. Yeah, and not just last year. From the beginning. I didn't realize it until after we'd all gone back, how much that place had just followed me. He glanced at Charlie. Sorry, it must be even weirder for you. Charlie shrugged uncomfortably. Maybe. I think it's just different. Her hand was resting on the table beside her water glass, and now John reached out to touch it. She stiffened, and he drew back. Sorry, he said. I'm sorry. It's not you, Charlie said quickly. His dead face, the dead skin of his throat. She had barely noticed it at the time, overwhelmed by the whole experience, but now the feeling of the dead man's neck came back to her. It was as if she were touching him right now. She could feel his skin, slack and cold, and slick with blood. She could feel the blood on her fingers. She rubbed her hands together. They were clean. She knew they were clean, but still she could feel the blood. You're being dramatic. I'll be right back, she said, and got up before John could respond. She made her way around the tables to the bathrooms at the back of the restaurant. It was a 3-stall bathroom. Thankfully, it was empty. Charlie went straight to the sink and turned the hot water on full blast. She pumped soap onto her hands and scrubbed them for a long time. She closed her eyes and focused on the feeling of hot water and soap, and slowly the memory of blood faded. As she dried her hands, she looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection looked wrong somehow, off, as if it wasn't herself she saw, but a copy. Someone else dressed as her. Get it together, Charlie, she thought, trying to hear the words in Aunt Jen's voice, as she had before. She closed her eyes. Get it together. When she opened them again, she was back in the mirror. Her reflection was her own. Charlie smoothed her hair and went back out to the table, where John was waiting for her with a concerned expression. Is everything okay? He asked nervously. Did I do something? Charlie shook her head. No, of course not. It's been a long day, that's all. There's an understatement. She glanced at her watch. Do we still have time for a movie? She asked. It's almost 8:30. Yeah, we should go, John said. Are you done? Yeah, it was really good, thank you. She smiled at him. The lady liked it. John smiled back, visibly relaxing. He went to the counter to pay, and Charlie went outside, waiting for him on the sidewalk. Dark had fallen, and there was a chill in the air. Charlie wished briefly that she'd thought to bring a sweatshirt. John joined her after a moment. Ready? Yeah, Charlie said. Where is it? He looked at her for a moment and shook his head. The movie was your idea, remember? He laughed. Like I said, I don't get out much. Charlie looked down at her feet. The theater's only a few blocks away. They walked in silence for a while. I found out what happened to Freddy's, she said without thinking, and John looked at her, surprised. Really? What happened? They were tearing it down. Then the storm came and everyone got called away. Now it's just standing there, half collapsed. All the stuff is gone, though, she added, seeing the question in John's eyes. I don't know what they did with them. It was a lie. Charlie couldn't tell him what had really happened without telling him how she knew. All those questions led back to the same place, the dead man in the field. Who were you? What about your father's house? John asked. Did you ask your Aunt Jen about it? What's she going to do with it? I don't know, Charlie said. I haven't talked to her since August. She fell silent, not looking at John as they walked. They reached their destination, a shabby one-screen movie theater named the Grand Palace. Its name was either ironic or wishful thinking. Emblazoned on the marquee was their current showing, Zombies versus Zombies. I think it's about zombies, John joked as they went inside. The movie had already started. Someone on screen was screaming, as what were apparently zombies came at her from all sides. She was surrounded. The creatures crouched like wild dogs, ready to spring and devour her. They moved to attack, and a man grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety. Charlie. John touched her arm, whispering. Over there. He gestured to the back row. The place was half full, but the back row was empty, and they made their way furtively to the middle. They sat, and Charlie turned her attention to the screen. Thank goodness, she thought. Maybe we can finally relax. She settled back in her seat, letting the images on the screen blur past her. Shrieks, gunfire, and thrumming music filled the silence between them. From the corner of her eye, she saw John glance at her nervously. Charlie focused her attention on the movie. The main characters, a man and woman with the generic, angular good looks of the big screen, were shooting automatic weapons into a crowd of zombies. As the first ranks were stopped, though severed in half by the guns, they still twitched on the ground. The ones behind climbed over their fallen cohorts. The camera switched back to the man and woman, who jumped a fence and took off running. Behind them, the zombies kept coming, struggling forward, oblivious to the undead bodies they waded through. The music was urgent, the bass line pounding like an artificial heartbeat, and Charlie relaxed against the seat, letting herself be absorbed into it all. What was he doing there? The image of the dead man returned to her. Something about the wounds bothered her, but she hadn't been able to put her finger on it. I recognized those wounds. They all matched what I remembered, but something was different. What was it? She sensed movement next to her, and saw John trying to stretch an arm toward her. "Really?" she thought. "Do you have enough room?" she asked him, and scooted away without waiting for a response. He looked embarrassed, but she glanced away, planting her elbow on the other armrest and staring fixedly at the screen. Enough room. That's it. She closed her eyes, concentrating on the image in her head. The wounds were slightly larger and more spaced out. The suit he was wearing was bigger than the suits from Freddy's. The man was probably 5'10" or 5'11", which means the suits must have been at least 7 feet tall. On screen, there was quiet again, but it was short-lived. Charlie watched, mesmerized, as the dirt spilled away of its own volition, moving like magic as the zombie rose. It wouldn't be like that, Charlie thought definitively. It's not that easy to get out of a grave. By now, the zombie on screen was halfway out, crawling to the surface and looking around with its glassy, mindless eyes. You can't get out that fast. Charlie blinked and shook her head, trying to stay focused. Zombies. Lifeless things. The closet was full of costumes, lifeless yet ever watching, with plastic eyes and dead, hanging limbs. Somehow their corpse-like stares had never bothered her, or Sammy. They liked to touch the fur, sometimes put it in their mouths and giggle at the funny way it felt. Some was old and matted, some new and soft. The closet was their place, just for the two of them. Sometimes they babbled together in words that had meaning only to them. Sometimes they played side by side, lost in separate worlds of make-believe. But they were always together. Sammy was playing with a truck when the shadow came. He ran it back and forth on the floor, not noticing that their ribbon of light had been cut off. Charlie turned and saw the shadow, so still he could be an illusion, just another costume out of place. Then the sudden movement, the chaos of fabric and eyes. The truck clanked as it fell to the floor, and then loneliness. A dark so complete that she began to believe she'd never seen at all. The memories of sight had only been a dream, a trick of the utter blackness. She tried to call his name. She could feel him nearby, but all around her were solid walls. "Can you hear me? Sammy? Let me out! Sammy?" But he was gone, and he was never there again. "Charlie, are you okay?" "What?" Charlie looked at John. She realized she'd pulled her feet up on the chair and was hugging her knees to her chest. She sat back, setting her shoes back on the floor. John gave her a concerned look. "I'm fine," she whispered, and gestured to the screen. John put a hand on her forearm. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked. Charlie stared straight ahead. Now there were people running, the zombies lurching after them. "This doesn't make sense," Charlie muttered, mostly to herself. "What?" John leaned toward her. Charlie didn't move, but she repeated herself. "It doesn't make sense. Zombies don't make sense. If they're dead, the central nervous system is shot, and they can't do any of this. If there's a functioning central nervous system, which has somehow decayed to the point that movement and thought are possible, but severely hindered, fine. If it makes them violent, fine. But why would they want to eat brains? It doesn't make sense." That man wouldn't have been able to walk on his own in a suit so oversized. He didn't walk into that field. The suit did. The animatronic was carrying him inside. It walked into that field of its own accord. "Maybe it's symbolic," John suggested, eager to engage, however odd the conversation. "You know, like the idea that you eat your enemy's heart to gain their power. Maybe the zombie eats its enemy's brain to gain its Central nervous system? He glanced at Charlie, but she was only half listening. Okay, she said. She'd been irritated by the movie. Now she was irritated by the conversation she herself had introduced. I'll be right back, she told John, and got up without waiting for him to respond. She made her way out of the row, through the lobby, and out the door. On the sidewalk, she took a deep breath and felt an intense relief at the wash of fresh air. Dreams about being trapped are common, she reminded herself. She'd looked it up when they began. They were only slightly less common than dreams of showing up to class naked, plummeting from a great height, or having your teeth all suddenly fall out. But this didn't feel like a dream. Charlie jostled her thoughts back to the present, where even the crime scene of a gruesome murder seemed like a safer place to keep them. There must be tracks. He didn't walk there himself. There must be some clue of what carried him into that field, and where it came from. Charlie shivered. She went back inside the building. John's going to think I'm nuts. She arrived at the swinging theater doors and stopped. She couldn't do it. She had to know. There was a young man at the concession stand, and she asked him if the place had a payphone. He pointed silently to his right, and Charlie went, fishing in her pocket for a quarter, and for Chief Burke's card. She dialed carefully, pausing between numbers to check the card again, as if the writing might have changed since she looked. Clay Burke answered on the third ring. Burke. Clay, it's Charlie. Charlie? What's wrong? He was instantly alert. Charlie could picture him leaping to his feet, ready to run. Nothing, I'm fine, she assured him. Everything is okay. I just wanted to see if you found anything else. Not so far, he told her. Oh. Burke let the silence stretch between them, and Charlie finally broke it. Is there anything else you can tell me? I know it's confidential, but you've brought me in this far. Please, if there's anything else you know, anything else you found, anything you know about the man, the victim. No, Clay said slowly. I mean, I'll let you know when we find something. Okay, Charlie said. Thanks. I'll be in touch. Okay. Charlie hung up the phone before he could say goodbye. I don't believe you, she said to the phone on the wall. Back in the theater, her eyes took a moment to adjust as she inched along the back row toward her seat, careful not to make noise. John looked up at her with a smile as she sat down, but didn't say anything. Charlie smiled back with a grim determination and settled back in her seat, then scooted over until her shoulder was pressed against his. From behind her head, she heard him make a surprised noise. Then he shifted, putting his arm around her shoulders. He gripped her tightly for a moment, halfway to a hug, and Charlie leaned in a little, unsure how else to reciprocate. What if someone put him in the costume, like some kind of wind-up death trap? Stuck him inside that thing, then sent it walking until the spring locks went off. But who would know how to do that? Why would someone do that? Did I miss anything? Charlie asked, though she hadn't paid any attention to the first half of the movie anyway. It was daytime on screen, and it looked like there were more people, holed up in some sort of bunker. Charlie couldn't remember which of them had been the original characters. She wriggled in her seat. John's arm around her had relaxed, but now the arm of the seat was digging into her side. He started to move away, but she settled herself again. No, it's okay, she whispered, and his arms circled her again. Just get on with it, Charlie said, flustered. John startled. Sorry, I didn't want to be too aggressive. No, not you. Charlie gestured toward the screen. They should just build a minefield around the bunker and wait for them to all blow up. The end. I think that's actually what they do in the sequel, but we'll have to wait to watch it for ourselves. He winked. There's another one? She sighed. When the credits started to roll, they gathered their things and headed to the exits with the rest of the small crowd, not speaking until they got outside. On the sidewalk, they stopped. This has been nice, John said, sounding, somehow, like he meant it, and Charlie laughed, then groaned, covering her face with both hands. This has been awful. This has been the worst date ever. I'm so sorry. Thanks for lying, though. John gave an uncertain smile. It was nice to see you, he said with cautious levity. It's just, can we go somewhere to talk? John nodded, and Charlie started back toward campus with him following behind. The quad was usually empty late at night, or at least mostly empty. There was always someone walking across, some student finishing up late-night work in a lab, some couple ensconced in a dark corner. Tonight was no different, and it was easy enough to find their own dark corner to talk. Charlie sat down under a tree, and John copied her, then waited for her to talk as she stared at the gap between two buildings, where you could almost see the woods. Finally, he prompted her. So, what's up? Right. She met his eyes. Clay came to see me today. John's eyes widened, but he didn't say anything. He took me to see a body, Charlie went on. He had died inside one of the mascot costumes. John was frowning. She could almost see his thoughts, working through what this meant and why it involved Charlie. That's not all. Clay told me that they found blood in the main dining room at Freddy's. Fake blood. John's head jerked up. You think Dave's alive? Charlie shrugged. Clay didn't come out and say it, but all those scars. He had survived the spring locks of a mascot costume before. He must have known how to escape the building. It didn't look to me like he escaped, John said doubtfully. He could have faked it. It would certainly explain the blood. So, what then? Dave is alive and stuffing people into spring-lock suits and killing them? If I could just go back to the restaurant one more time, to make sure that... Charlie stopped, suddenly aware of growing anger in John's face. To make sure that what? He asked sternly. Nothing. Clay has it under control. Everything is best left with the police. She clenched her jaw, gazing out over the horizon. Jessica will go with me. Right, John said with a surprised look. Right. You're right. Charlie nodded with forced enthusiasm. Clay has men for this sort of thing, she continued with a furrowed brow. I'm sure they're on top of it. John took Charlie's shoulders lightly. I'm sure it's not what you think it is anyway, he said in a hearty, reassuring tone. There's a lot of crime in this world that doesn't involve self-imploding furry robot suits. He laughed and Charlie forced a smile. Come on. John extended a hand and Charlie took it. I'll walk you to your dorm. I appreciate the gesture, she said. But Jessica's there, and we'd have to go through the whole reunion, you know? John laughed. Okay, I'll save you from Jessica and her relentless camaraderie. Charlie grinned. My hero. Where are you staying anyway? That little motel you stayed at last year, actually, John said. I'll see you tomorrow, maybe? Charlie nodded and watched him go, then started on her own way home. Excruciating though the date had been, the last half hour felt like a homecoming. It was her and John again. They were familiar again. All we needed was a good old-fashioned murder, she said aloud, and a woman walking her dog gave Charlie an odd look as she passed in the opposite direction. "I was at a movie, Zombies vs. Zombies," Charlie called half-heartedly after her retreating back. "You should go check it out. They don't put mines around the bunker. Spoiler alert." Charlie had half hoped Jessica would be asleep, but the lights were on when she reached their room. She flung open the door before Charlie had her key out of her pocket, her face flushed. "So?" Jessica demanded. "So what?" Charlie asked, grinning in spite of herself. "Hey, before you start into this, I need to ask you something." "So you know what?" Jessica cried, ignoring her question. "Tell me about John. How did it go?" Charlie felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "Oh, you know," she said casually. "Listen, I need you to go somewhere with me in the morning." "Charlie, you have to tell me." Jessica moaned exaggeratedly and flopped back on her bed. Then she sprang back up into a sitting position. "Come here and tell me." Charlie sat, drawing her legs up under her. "It was weird," she admitted. "I didn't know what to say. Dates just seemed so uncomfortable. But about what I was saying. But it's John. Shouldn't that outweigh the date part?" "Well, it didn't," Charlie said. She looked at the floor. She could tell her face was red, and suddenly she wished she hadn't told Jessica anything at all. Jessica put her hands on Charlie's shoulders and looked at her seriously. "You are amazing, and if John isn't just falling all over himself for you, that's his problem." Charlie giggled. "I think he kind of is. It's part of the problem. But there is something else if you would just listen for a second." "Oh, there's more?" Jessica laughed. "Charlie, you need to save something for the second date, you know." "What? No. I need you to go somewhere with me in the morning." "Charlie, I have a lot going on right now. I have exams coming up and I need you." Charlie clenched her jaw for a moment. "I need you to help me pick out new clothes for my next date," she said carefully, then waited to see if Jessica would believe a word of it. "Charlie, are you kidding me? We'll go first thing in the morning." She jumped up and gave Charlie a giant hug. "We'll have a girls' day out. It will be amazing." Jessica flopped back to her bed. "Sleep for now, though. It won't bother you if I work on my project for a while, will it?" "Not at all." Jessica waved limply, then went still. Charlie turned on her work lamp, a single bright beam that was focused enough to not illuminate the whole room. She uncovered the faces. They were at rest, their features smooth as if in sleep, but she didn't turn them on yet. The switches that made them move and talk were only one part of the whole. There was another component. The part that made them listen was always on. Everything that she and Jessica said, every word spoken in the room, outside the window, or even in the hall, they heard. Each new word went into their databases, not only as a single word, but in all its configurations as they emerged. Each new piece of information was stuck to the piece of information most like it. Everything new was built on something old. They were always learning. Charlie turned on the component that allowed them to speak. Their features rippled softly, as if they were stretching themselves. "I know," said the first, more quickly than usual. "So what?" said the second. "Know what?" "You know so what?" "Know what?" "Now what?" "What now?" "Know how?" "Why now?" Charlie switched them off, staring as the fan slowed to a stop. That didn't make sense. She looked at her watch. It was about 3 hours too late for bed. She changed quickly and climbed under the sheets, leaving the faces uncovered. There was something unnerving about their exchange. It was faster than it had ever been, and it was nonsensical. But there was something about it that rang familiar. It struck her. "Were you playing a game?" she asked. They couldn't answer, and just stared blankly into each other's eyes. Chapter 4. She removed the pillowcase gently, taking care not to let it catch on anything. Beneath their shroud, the faces, blank and sightless, were placid. They looked like they could wait, ever listening, for eternity. Charlie switched them on and bent over to watch as they began to move their plastic mouths without sound, practicing. "Where?" said the first. "Here," said the second. "Where?" said the first again. Charlie drew back. Something was wrong with the voice. It sounded strained. "Here," repeated the second. "Where?" said the first with a rising intonation, like it was growing upset. That's not supposed to happen, Charlie thought, alarmed. They shouldn't be able to modulate their voices. "Where?" the first wailed, and Charlie stepped back. She leaned down slowly to peer under the desk, as though she might find an entanglement of wires that would explain the strange behavior. As she stared, puzzled, a baby began to cry. She stood at once, knocking her head painfully on the edge of the desk. The two faces looked suddenly more human and more childlike. One was crying, the other watching with an astonished look on its face. "It's okay," said the calmer face. "Don't leave me," the other wailed as it turned to look at Charlie. "I'm not going to leave you," Charlie cried. "Everything will be okay." The sound of crying swelled, higher and louder than human voices should be, and Charlie covered her ears, looking desperately around for someone to help. Her bedroom had darkened, and heavy things hung from the ceiling. Matted fur brushed her face, and her heart jolted. The children are not safe. She turned back, but an acre of fabric and fur had somehow fallen between her and the wailing babies. "I'll find you!" She shoved her way through, tripping on limbs that dragged on the ground. The costumes swung wildly, like trees in a storm, and a little distance away, something fell to the floor with a hard clunk. At last, she reached her desk, but they were gone. The howling went on and on, so loud Charlie couldn't hear herself think, even as she realized that the screaming was her own. Charlie sat up with a loud, raw gasp, as if she had actually been screaming. "Charlie?" It was John's voice. Charlie looked around with one bleary eye to see a head peering through the bedroom door. "Give me a minute," Charlie called as she sat up straight. "Get out," she cried, and John's head shrank back. The door closed. She felt shaky, her muscles weak. She'd been holding them tense in her sleep. She changed quickly into clean clothes and tried to brush her slightly tangled hair into something more manageable, then opened the door. John poked his head in again, taking a cautious look around. "Okay, come in. It's not booby-trapped, though maybe it should be," Charlie joked. "How did you get in here?" "Well, it was open, and John trailed off as he took in the room around him, momentarily distracted by the mess. "I thought maybe we could go to breakfast. I have to work across town in about 40 minutes, but I have some time." "Oh, what a nice thought, but she said. "Sorry for the mess. It's my project. I sort of get wrapped up in it and forget to clean." She glanced at her desk. The pillowcase was in place as it should be, the vague outlines of the faces just visible beneath it. It was just a dream. John shrugged. "Yeah? What's the project?" Language? Sort of." She looked around the room curiously. Where had Jessica wandered off to? Charlie knew John would be suspicious of her sudden, unprecedented interest in clothes shopping, and was hoping to avoid explanations. Natural language programming, she went on. I'm taking computer programming classes. At the last moment, something stopped her from saying the word robotics. John nodded. He was still eyeing the mess, and Charlie couldn't tell what had caught his attention. She plunged back into her explanation. So, I'm working on teaching language, spoken language, to computers. She walked briskly to the door and peered out into the hall. Don't computers already know language? John called. Well, yeah, Charlie said as she returned to the room. She looked at John. His face had changed, stripped down to something more adult. But she could still see him as he'd been the year before, captivated as he watched her old mechanical toys. I can tell him. But then a look of alarm crossed John's face. He surged forward to her bed, stopping a few inches from it. He pointed. Is that Theodore's head? He asked carefully. Yeah, Charlie said. She walked to the windows and peeped through the blinds, trying to spot Jessica's car. So, you have been to the house? No. Well, yeah. I went back once, she confessed. To get him. She looked back at John guiltily. He shook his head. Charlie, you don't have to explain yourself, he said. It's your house. He grabbed the chair from her desk and sat down. Why did you take him apart? She studied his face worriedly, wondering if he was already asking himself the next, obvious question. What if it runs in the family? I wanted to see how he worked, Charlie said. She spoke carefully, feeling like she had to appear as rational as possible. I would have taken Stanley and Ella too, but, you know. They're bolted to the floor? Pretty much, yeah. So I took Theodore. I'm actually using some of his components in my project. Charlie looked down at the disembodied bunny's head, into its blank glass eyes. Took him apart, using his component parts. That sounds rational. She had gotten Theodore from her father's house just before school began. Jessica hadn't been home. It was early evening, not quite dark, and Charlie had smuggled Theodore inside her backpack. She took him out, set him on the bed, and pressed the button to make him talk. As before, there was nothing but a strangled sound. Ooh, Lee. The scrambled, decayed traces of her father's voice. Charlie had felt a pang of anger at herself for even trying. You sound pretty awful, she said harshly to Theodore, who just looked up at her blankly, immune to the reprimand. Charlie rifled through her bag of tools and parts, which hadn't yet taken over her side of the room. She found her utility knife, then went grimly to her bed where the bunny waited. I'll put you back together when I'm done. Right. She looked up at John now, saw the doubt on his face. Or maybe it was concern, just like Jessica. Sorry, I know everything's a mess, she said, hearing the edge in her own voice. Maybe I'm a mess too, she added quietly. She set the bunny's head down on her pillow, and the part of his leg beside it. So, do you still want to see my project? She asked. Yes. He smiled reassuringly and followed her to her desk. Charlie hesitated, looking down at the pillowcase. Just a dream. So, she said nervously. Charlie carefully switched everything on before unveiling the faces. Lights began to blink, and fans began to whir. She glanced at John again, and took off the cloth. The faces moved in little patterns, as if stretching out after waking, though there was little they could stretch. Charlie swallowed nervously. You, me, said the first one, and Charlie heard John make a surprised sound behind her. Me, said the second. Charlie held her breath, but they fell silent. Sorry, they usually say more, Charlie said. She grabbed a small object from the table and held it up. It was an oddly shaped piece of clear plastic with wiring inside. John frowned for a moment. Is that a hearing aid? He asked, and Charlie nodded enthusiastically. It used to be. It's something I'm experimenting with. They listen all the time. They pick up everything that's said around them, but they're just collecting data, not interacting with it. They can only interact with each other. She paused, waiting for a sign that John understood. He nodded, and she went on. I'm still working out the kinks, but this thing should make the person wearing it visible to them. Not literally visible, I mean, they can't see, but they'll recognize the person wearing the device as one of them. She looked expectantly at John. Why? What does that mean? He asked, seeming to search for words. Charlie closed her hand on the earpiece, frustrated. He doesn't understand. I made them. I want to interact with them, she said. His expression grew thoughtful, and she looked away, suddenly regretting having shown him the object. Anyway, it's not really finished. She edged to the door and glanced out. It's really cool, John called after her. When Charlie returned from the hallway, he gave her an odd look. Is everything okay? Yes. You should go, though. You'll be late for work. Charlie approached the faces. She looked down thoughtfully at her creations, then sighed and reached for the pillowcase to cover them. As she did, the second face moved. It jerked back on its stand and pivoted, locking its blind eyes on Charlie's. She stared back. It was like looking at a statue. The eyes were only raised bumps in the molded plastic. But Charlie swallowed hard, feeling herself rooted to the spot. She studied the blank gaze until John put a hand on her shoulder. She jumped, startling him as well, then looked down at the earpiece in her hand. Oh, right, Charlie mumbled, and pressed the tiny power button on the side of it. She placed the earpiece carefully on top of the mess in her desk drawer, then closed the drawer. The face was still for a moment, then it slowly turned back to its place. It settled there, locked in a mirrored stare with its double, as if it had never moved at all. Charlie covered them and switched them off, leaving them with only enough power to listen. At last, she looked up at John. Sorry, she said. Does that mean no to breakfast? I have plans this morning, Charlie said. Me and Jessica. You know, girl stuff. Really? John said quietly. Girl stuff? You? Yes, girl stuff. Jessica squealed as she entered the room excitedly. Shopping. I finally convinced Charlie it's worth trying on her clothes before she buys them. We might even move past jeans and boots. Are you ready? Ready, Charlie smiled, and John squinted at her. Jessica began escorting him gently out the door. Right, John said. I'll see you later then, Charlie? Charlie didn't respond, but Jessica gave a bright smile as she closed the door behind him. So, Jessica clasped her hands. Where do you want to start today? When they got to the parking lot of the abandoned mall, it was early afternoon. Charlie, this isn't what I had in mind, Jessica cried as they got out of the car. Charlie started for the entrance, but Jessica didn't follow. When Charlie turned, she was leaning against the car with her arms crossed. What are we doing here? Jessica asked, her eyebrows raised. We have to look inside, Charlie said. People's lives might depend on it. I just want to see if there is anything left of Freddy's. Then we can go. Whose lives depend on it? And why now suddenly? Jessica asked. Charlie looked at her shoes. I just want to see, she said. She felt like a petulant child, but she couldn't bring herself to tell Jessica the whole story. Is this because John is here? Jessica asked suddenly, and Charlie looked up, surprised. What? No. Jessica sighed and uncrossed her arms. It's okay, Charlie. I get it. You haven't seen him since all of this happened, and then he shows up again. Of course it brings everything back. Charlie nodded, gratefully latching on to this rationale. It was easier than hiding the truth from her. I doubt there's much left anyway, she said. I just want to walk through and remind myself that it's really over. Jessica finished. She smiled, and Charlie's heart sank. It's really, really not over. She forced a smile. Something like that. Charlie walked quickly through the mall, but Jessica lagged behind. The place felt entirely different. Sunlight poured in through massive gaps in the unfinished walls and ceiling. Shafts of light sifted between smaller cracks and splashed against stacks of concrete slabs. Charlie could see moths, maybe butterflies, hovering at the windows, and as they passed through the empty halls on their way to Freddy's, she could hear birds chirping. The deathly quiet she remembered, the overpowering sense of dread, was gone. Yet, Charlie thought as she glanced at the half-constructed storefronts, it still felt haunted, maybe even more than before. It was a different kind of haunting, not frightening. But Charlie had the sense that something was present, like stepping onto hallowed ground. Hello? Charlie said softly, not sure whom she was addressing. Do you hear something? Jessica slowed her pace. No, it feels smaller. Charlie gestured at the open mouths of the never-open department stores, and the end of the hall ahead of them. It seemed so intimidating last time. It actually seems kind of peaceful. Jessica spun in place, enjoying the air from outside, which was flowing freely through the empty spaces. Jessica followed Charlie through the doorway, and they stopped dead, blinded by bright sunlight. Freddy's had been torn apart. Some of the walls still stood. The far end looked almost intact, but in front of her was a field of debris. Old bricks and broken tiles were strewn in the dirt. The two of them stood now on a slab of concrete that lay baking in the sun. The passage inward, along with the entire side wall of the restaurant, was gone. The walls and ceiling were just a line of rubble against the trees. The concrete walkway was still there, worn dark by years of dank and leaking pipes. So much for Freddy's, Jessica said in a hushed voice, and Charlie nodded. They made their way through the debris. Charlie could make out where the main dining room had been, but everything was gone. The tables and chairs, the checkered cloths, and the party hats had all been removed. The merry-go-round had been ripped out, leaving nothing but a hole in the floor and some stray wires. The stage itself had been assaulted, though not removed. They must have been in the middle of that when the job was stopped. Boards were torn up across the main stage area, and the left-hand set of stairs was gone. What was left of the wall behind the stage broke off at the top, like jagged mountains along the sky. Are you okay? Jessica looked to Charlie. Yeah, it's not what I expected, but I'm okay. She thought for a moment. I want to see what's still here. Charlie gestured to the stage, and they crossed what was left of the dining area. The floorboards cracked, the linoleum torn. Jessica peered under a pile of rock where arcade machines had been. The consoles that had stood like dusty gravestones were gone, but they could see the outlines of each one. Square patches remained where they'd been torn from their posts. Stray wires huddled in small piles in the corners. Charlie turned her attention back to the main stage. She climbed up to where the animatronic animals had once performed. "Careful!" Jessica cried. Charlie nodded in absent acknowledgement. She stood to one side, remembering the layout. This is where Freddy stood. The boards were torn up in front of her and in 2 more places. The destruction here was where they had taken out the pivoting plates that bolted the mascots to the stage. Not that they stayed bolted very long, Charlie thought wryly. She could see it now if she closed her eyes. The animals were going through their programmed motions, faster and faster, until it was clear they were out of control, moving wildly as if they were afraid. They were rocking on their stands, and then the awful sound of cracking wood as Bonnie lifted his bolted foot and tore himself free of the stage. Charlie shook her head, trying to rid herself of the image. She made her way to the back of the stage. The lights were all gone, but a skeleton of exposed beams crisscrossed the open sky where the lights had been. "Jessica," she called. "Where are you?" "Down here." She followed the sound of the girl's voice. Jessica was crouched in the place where the control room had been, peering into the gap under the stage. "Nothing?" Charlie asked, not sure what answer she was hoping for. "It's been gutted," Jessica said. "No monitors, nothing." Charlie climbed down beside her, and they peered in together. "This is where we were trapped last time," Jessica said quietly. "Me and John. There was something at the door, and the lock caught. I thought we would be stuck in that little room and—" She looked at Charlie, who simply nodded. The horrors of that night were unique to each of them. The moments that beset them in their sleep, or assailed their thoughts without warning in the middle of the day, were private. "Come on," Charlie said abruptly, heading again toward the mound of rubble where more games had been. Charlie crouched under a large slab that leaned to the side and acted as a doorway to what was left of the place. "This seems dangerous." Jessica tiptoed over the loose rock. The floor was still covered in carpet in most places, and Charlie could see the deep grooves where the arcade machine had been. She hurled herself at the console, and somehow it was enough. It wobbled on its base, then fell, knocking Foxy to the ground and pinning him there. She ran, but he was too quick. He caught her by the leg and ripped his hook right through her. She screamed, staring down at the snapping, twisted metal jaws and the burning silver eyes. She heard a noise, almost a whimper, and realized it was her. She clapped her hands over her mouth. "I thought we were all going to die," Jessica whispered. "Me too," Charlie said. They looked at each other for a moment, an eerie stillness settling over the sunlit wreckage. "Hey, this place is probably going to fall on us soon, so—" Jessica broke the silence, gesturing to the leaning slabs of concrete surrounding them. Charlie crawled back out the way they'd come and stood up. Her knees were crawling with pins and needles. She rubbed them, then stomped the ground. "I want to check the costume room, see if anything is left," Charlie said without expression. "You mean to see if anybody is left?" Jessica shook her head. "I have to know." Charlie gave her jeans a final brush and started off toward it. The room stuck out of the rubble, alone and intact. It was the place where the costumes had been kept, and where Carlton had briefly been held prisoner. Charlie cautiously poked her head inside, studying the physical details around her. The chipped paint on the wall, the carpet that someone had begun to tear up but left unfinished. "Don't think about last time. Don't think about what happened here." She let her eyes adjust a moment longer, then went inside. The room was empty. They did a cursory search, but everything had been removed. There was nothing left but walls, floor, and ceiling. Clay did say they had gotten rid of everything, Charlie said. Jessica gave her a sharp look. Clay? When? He said he was going to, I mean, Charlie said hastily, covering the slip. Last year. They took a final look around. As they were leaving, Charlie spotted a glint of light from something in the corner. It was the plastic eyeball of some unknown animatronic mascot. Charlie was about to go to it, but stopped herself. There's nothing here, she said. Not waiting for Jessica, she headed back through the debris, looking down at her feet as she stepped over bricks and stones and shattered glass. Hey, wait! Jessica called after her hastily. Pirate's Cove! Charlie, look! Charlie stopped. She watched Jessica as she climbed over a steel beam and stepped carefully over the remains of a fallen wall. In front of her, a curtain lay strewn across what had appeared to be a pile of rubble. Charlie followed her, and when she caught up, she could see that the curtain concealed a gap in the ruins. The tops of a few glittering chairs peeked out from the stones. A row of broken stage lights lay across the top of the curtain, as though holding it in place. It looks pretty good, compared to the rest of the place, Jessica said. Charlie didn't answer. There was a dirty poster lying flat on the ground, depicting a cartoonish Foxy delivering pizzas to happy children. Jessica, look. Charlie pointed to the ground. Those look like claw marks, Jessica said after a moment. There were long scratches and scrapes running the length of the floor, and dark marks that looked like traces of blood. It's like someone was being dragged. Jessica stood and followed the scratches. They led behind the curtain, away from the area where Pirate's Cove once stood. The stage, Jessica said. When they moved the curtain aside, they found the stage had a small hatch at the back. Storage, Charlie murmured. She pulled on it, but the hatch wouldn't open. There has to be a latch somewhere, Jessica said. She cleared away dirt and broken wood from the base of the stage, uncovering a deadbolt that went into the floor. She pulled it up, releasing the door, which swung open like something was pushing against it. A face lurched out of the darkness, two gaping eyes swinging forward. Jessica screamed and fell backward. Charlie recoiled. The masked face hung lifelessly from a rotted fur costume. An entire mascot suit was inside, crammed into a space much too small for it. Charlie stopped, her whole body numb with shock as she stared at the thing with a dread almost as old as she was. The yellow rabbit, she whispered. It's Dave, Jessica gasped. Charlie took a deep breath, forcing herself back into the present. Come on, help me, she said. She stepped forward and grabbed at the fabric, pulling on whatever she could reach. You're kidding. I'm not touching that thing. Jessica, get over here, Charlie commanded, and Jessica came reluctantly over. Ew, ew, ew. Jessica touched the suit, then recoiled. She gave Charlie a flat look and tried again, yanking her hands away as soon as she touched it. Ew, she repeated quietly, then finally screwed her eyes shut and took hold of it. Together they pulled, but nothing happened. I think it's stuck, Jessica said. They shifted positions and finally heaved the mascot out of the cramped space. The fabric caught on stray nails and jagged wood, but Charlie kept pulling. At last the creature was out, splayed heavily on the ground. I definitely don't think Dave faked his own death, Charlie said. What if it's not him? Jessica peered carefully into the face. It's him. Charlie looked at the dried blood soaked into the mascot's fingertips. The spring locks might not have killed him right away, but this is where he died. They could see Dave's body through the gaps in the costume, and the wide, carved eyes of the mascot head showed through to his face. His skin was desiccated and shriveled. His eyes were wide open, his face expressionless and discolored. Charlie moved closer again. Her initial shock had passed, and now she was curious to see more of him. She probed carefully at first, in case some of the spring locks inside might still be waiting to snap, but it was clear that they'd already done their damage. The locks had been driven so deeply into his skin that the bases of each were flush against his neck. They looked like part of him. Charlie studied the chest of the costume. There were large tears in the yellow fabric, which had gone green and pink with mold in patches. She grabbed hold of the sides and pulled the gap open as wide as she could. Jessica watched, fascinated, her hand over her mouth. Skewers of metal protruded through his entire body, dull and crusted with his blood. And there were more complex parts, twisted knots of gore with many layers of machinery that stuck out from his body. The suit's fabric was stiff with blood, too, yet the man didn't seem to have rotted, despite the year that had passed. "It's like he's fused with the suit," Charlie said. She tugged at the mascot head, trying to pull it off, but gave up quickly. The gaping eyes stared up at her, behind which was the dead man's face. With the light directly on him, Dave's skin appeared sickly and discolored. Charlie felt a sudden rush of nausea. She pulled back from the corpse and looked up at Jessica. "So now what?" Jessica said. "Did you want to give him a foot massage, too?" She abruptly turned her head away, gagging at her own joke. "Listen, I have class in..." Charlie checked her watch. "About an hour. Did you still want to do some shopping?" "Why can't I have normal friends?" Jessica groaned. Chapter 5. We are learning all the time. Hopefully at least some of you are learning right here in this class. Dr. Treadwell's students laughed nervously, but she continued over them. It had apparently not been a joke. When we learn, our minds must decide where we will store that information. Unconsciously, we determine what group of things it is most relevant to and connected to that group. This is, of course, only the most rudimentary explanation. When computers do this, we call it an information tree. Charlie was only half listening. She knew this already and was taking her notes on autopilot. Since their expedition to Freddy's the day before, she hadn't been able to get the image of Dave's body out of her head. His torso and the gruesome lace of scars that had covered it. When he was alive, he'd shown them off to her, boasting of his survival. While he never told her what had happened, it must have been an accident. He used to wear those suits all the time. She could see him now, before all the murders, dressed as a yellow bunny and dancing merrily with a yellow bear. She shook her head suddenly, trying to get rid of the image. "Are you okay?" Arty whispered. She nodded, waving him off. But the dead man in the field, that wasn't an accident. Someone forced him inside. But why? Charlie restlessly tapped her fingers on her desk. "That will be all for today." Dr. Treadwell set down her chalk and stalked off the auditorium stage with a purposeful step. Her teaching assistant, a flustered graduate student, scurried forward to collect the homework. "Hey, do you have any time to go over some of this?" Arty asked Charlie as they gathered up their things. "I'm in a little bit over my head in this class." Charlie paused. She'd promised to make up her first date with John, but she wasn't meeting him for over an hour. Now that she'd been to Freddy's, Charlie almost felt like she was on familiar ground, even if it was soaked in blood. "I have some time now," she told Arty, who lit up. "Great. Thanks so much. We can go work over at the library." Charlie nodded. "Sure." She followed him across the campus, only half engaged as he explained his difficulties with the material. They found a table, and Charlie opened her notebook to the pages she'd taken down today, pushing them across so Arty could see them. "Actually, do you mind if I sit next to you?" he asked. "It's easier if we're both looking at the same thing, right?" "Oh, yeah." Charlie pulled her notes back over as he came around and sat next to her, scooting his metal folding chair next to hers, just a few inches closer than she would have preferred. "So, where did you get lost?" she asked him. "I was telling you on the way over," he said, with a hint of reproach in his voice, then cleared his throat. "I guess I understood the beginning of the lecture, when she was reviewing last week's material." Charlie laughed. "So, basically you want to review everything new from today?" Arty nodded sheepishly. Charlie started from the beginning, pointing at her notes as she went. As she flipped through the pages, she noticed her own scribbles in the margins. Charlie leaned in closer, where harsh outlines of rectangles lined the bottom of the page. They were all colored in, like slabs of granite. She stared at them with a sensation of déjà vu. They were important. "I don't remember drawing that," she thought uneasily. Then, "It's just doodles. Everybody doodles." She turned the page to the next segment of the lecture, and a strange alertness rose at the base of her neck, as if someone might be watching her. There were more doodles in the margins of this page, too, and the next one. All of them were rectangles. Some were large and some were small, some scribbled and some outlined in so solidly that her pen had wet the paper through and torn it. All of them were vertical, taller than they were wide. Charlie stared, tilting her head to see from different angles, until something pinged inside her. "Sammy?" she thought. Then, "Is this you? Does this mean something I don't understand?" Charlie glanced at Arty. He was staring at the paper too. As she watched, he turned the page again. The next pages were the same. They were filled with neat, clear notes, but little rectangles were squashed into every available spot on the page, stuffed into the space between bullet points, crammed into the margins, and tucked away where lines came up short. Quickly, Arty flipped the page back. He looked up at her and smiled, but his eyes were wary. "Why don't you try the first problem here?" Charlie suggested. Arty bent over his worksheet, and Charlie stared down at her notebook. Her mind kept returning to her father's house, and the shapes she'd drawn only made the impulse stronger. "I have to go back." "Are you okay?" Arty leaned in cautiously. Charlie stared down at her notebook. Now that she'd noticed the rectangles, they seemed more prominent than the notes. She could focus on nothing else. "I have to go back." Charlie shut the notebook and blinked hard. She ignored Arty's question, shoving the notebook into her backpack. "I have to go," she said as she stood up. "But I'm still stuck on the first problem," Arty said. "I'm sorry, I really am," she called over her shoulder as she hurried away. She bumped into two people as she passed the circulation desk, but was too flustered to mutter an apology. When she got to the door, she stopped, her guts twisting. There's something wrong. She hesitated, her hand suspended in the air, as if something was blocking her path. She finally took hold of the knob, and instantly her hand felt fused to it, as if by an electrical current. She couldn't turn it, and she couldn't let go. Suddenly, the knob moved on its own. Someone was turning it from the other side. Charlie yanked her hand away and stepped back as a boy with an enormous backpack brushed past her. Snapping back into the moment, she slipped out before the door could swing shut again. Charlie sped toward Hurricane, trying to calm herself as she drove. The windows were cracked open and wind was rushing in. She thought back to Treadwell's lecture earlier in the week. At every moment, your senses are receiving far more information than they can process all at once. Maybe that was Arty's problem in class. Charlie gazed at the mountains ahead, the open fields on either side. Watching them go by, she began to feel like some restraint had been loosened. She'd been spending too much time in her room or in class, and not enough out in the world. It was making her jumpy, exaggerating her natural awkwardness. She rolled her window down farther, letting in the air. Over the field to her right, a few birds were circling. No. Charlie stopped the car. Something is wrong. She got out, feeling ridiculous, but the last few days had put her on a hair trigger. The birds were too large. She realized they were turkey vultures, and some of them were already on the ground, cautiously approaching what looked like a prone figure. Could be anything. She leaned against the car. Probably just a dead animal. After another moment, she turned back toward her car in frustration, but didn't get in. It's not a dead animal. She clenched her teeth and started to the spot the vultures were circling. As she got closer, the birds on the ground flapped their wings at the sight of her and soared away. Charlie dropped to her knees. It was a woman. Charlie's eyes went first to her clothing. It was ripped up, just like the dead man Clay Burke had shown her. She leaned over to check the woman's neck, though she knew what she would find. There were deep, ugly gouges from the spring locks of an animatronic suit. But before she could examine them closely, Charlie stopped, horrified. She looks just like me. The woman's face was bruised and scratched, which obscured her features. Charlie shook her head. It was easier to imagine more of a resemblance than there really was. But her hair was brown and cut like Charlie's, and her face was the same round shape, with the same complexion. Her features were different, but not that different. Charlie stood up and took a deliberate step back from the woman, suddenly aware of how exposed she was in the open field. Clay. I need to call Clay. She looked up at the sky, wishing for a way to keep the vultures at bay, to protect the body. I'm sorry, she whispered to the dead woman. I'll be back. Charlie started off to her car, then broke into a run, faster and faster across the field until she ran like something was right behind her. She got in and slammed the door, locking it as soon as she was inside. Panting heavily, Charlie thought for a second. She was about halfway between Hurricane and the school, but there was a gas station just down the road where she could call Clay. With a last glance at the spot where the body lay, Charlie pulled out onto the road. The gas station seemed to be empty. As she arrived, Charlie realized that she had never actually seen anyone fueling up here. Is this a working gas station? The place was old and shabby, which she had noticed in passing, but she'd never stopped to look around. The pumps looked functional, though not new, and there was no shelter above them. They simply stood on concrete blocks in the middle of a gravel driveway, exposed to the weather. The little building attached to the station might have been painted white once, but the paint had worn down to reveal gray boards underneath. It seemed to be tilting slightly, slipping on its foundation. There was a window, but it was filthy, almost the same color gray as the building's outside walls. Charlie hesitated, then went to the door and knocked. A young man answered, about Charlie's age, wearing a St. John's College t-shirt and jeans. "Yeah?" he said, giving her a blank stare. "Are you open?" "Yeah." He was chewing gum and wiped his hands on a grimy rag. Charlie took a deep breath. "I really need to use your phone." The boy opened the door and let her in. There was more space inside than she'd thought. In addition to the counter, there was a convenience store, though most of the shelves were empty and the line of refrigerators at the back was dark. The young man was looking at Charlie expectantly. "Can I use your phone?" she asked again. "Phones for customers only," he said. "Okay." Charlie glanced back at her car. "I'll get gas on the way out." "Pump's broken. Maybe you want something out of the cooler," he said, nodding at a grimy freezer with a sliding glass top and a faded patch of red paint that must once have been a logo. "We've got popsicles." "I don't want—" "Fine, I'll take a popsicle," Charlie said. "Pick out any one you want." Charlie leaned into the cooler. Pale, glassy eyes stared back at her. Beneath them was a furry red muzzle, its mouth open and poised to snap. Charlie screamed and hurtled backward, banging into the shelf behind her. Several cans fell off the shelf and rolled across the floor. The sound echoed in the empty space. "What is that?" Charlie yelled, but the boy was cackling so hard he was gasping for breath. Peering back inside, Charlie realized that someone had placed a taxidermic animal in the cooler, maybe a coyote. "That was great," he finally managed to say. Charlie drew herself up, shaking with rage. "I would like to use your phone now," she said coldly. The boy beckoned her to the counter, all smiles, and handed her a rotary phone. "No long distance, though," he warned. Charlie turned her back and dialed, walking toward the cooler as the phone rang. She peered in from the top, studying the stuffed canine from the high angle. "Clay Burke here." "Clay, it's Charlie. Listen, I need you to meet me. It's another—" She glanced at the young man behind the counter, who was watching her intently, not trying to hide the fact that he was listening. "It's like that thing you showed me before, with the cows." "What? Charlie, where are you?" "I'm at a gas station a few miles from you. Looks like someone painted an outhouse." "Hey!" The boy behind the counter straightened for a moment, taking offense. "Right, I know where you're at. I'll be right there." There was a click from the other end. "Thanks for the phone," Charlie said begrudgingly, and left without waiting for a reply. Charlie crouched again where the woman's body lay. She looked anxiously up the road for Clay's car, but it didn't appear. At least the vultures hadn't returned. "I could just stay in the car until he gets here," she thought. But Charlie didn't move from her spot. This woman had died horribly and been abandoned in a field. Now, at least, she didn't have to be alone. The more Charlie looked at her, the harder it was to dismiss the resemblance. Charlie shivered, even though the sun was warm on her back. She was filling with a cold, crawling dread. "Charlie?" Charlie spun around to see Clay Burke, then sighed and shook her head. "Sorry, I got here as fast as I could," he said lightly. She smiled. "It's okay. I'm just on edge today. I think that's the third time I've jumped in the air when someone said my name." Clay wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on the body. He knelt carefully beside it, scrutinizing it. Charlie could almost see him filing every detail away. She held her breath, not wanting to disturb him. "Did you touch the body?" he asked sharply, not looking away from the corpse. Yes, she admitted. I checked to see if she had the same injuries as the man.
Did she?
Yes, I know she was killed the same way. Clay nodded. Charlie watched as he got up and circled the woman, dropping down to look more closely at her head, and again at her feet. Finally, he turned his attention to Charlie again.
How did you find her?
He asked. I saw birds, vultures, circling above the field. I went to check.
Why did you go to check?
His eyes were hard, and Charlie felt a trickle of fear. Surely Clay didn't suspect her. Why wouldn't he, she thought. Who else would know how to use the spring locks? I bet he could come up with a million theories about me. Twisted girl avenges father's death. Acts out psychodrama. Film at 11. She took a deep breath, meeting Clay's eyes. I checked because of the body you showed me. It was in a field. I thought it might be another one. She kept her voice as steady as she could. Clay nodded, the steely expression slipping from his face, replaced by worry.
Charlie, this girl looks like you,
he said bluntly. Not that much like me.
She could be your twin,
Clay said. No, Charlie said, more harshly than she intended. She looks nothing like my twin. Clay gave her a puzzled look, then comprehension dawned.
I'm sorry. You had a twin, didn't you? Your brother.
I barely remember him, she said softly, then swallowed. All I do is remember him. I know she looks like me, she added weakly.
We're right near a college town,
Clay said.
She's a young white female with brown hair. You're not a rare type, Charlie. No offense.
Do you think it's a coincidence? Clay didn't look at her.
There was another body found this morning, he said.
Another girl? Charlie drew closer.
Yes, as a matter of fact. Been dead for a couple of days. Probably killed 2 nights ago.
Charlie looked down at him in alarm. Does that mean this is going to keep happening?
Unless you think we can stop it,
he said. Charlie nodded. I can help, she said. She looked again at the woman's face. She's nothing like me. Let me go to her house, she added abruptly, seized by a sudden impulse to prove it, to gather evidence that she and the victim were not the same.
What? Her house?
Clay said, giving her a dubious look. You asked me to help, Charlie said. Let me help. Clay didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the woman's pockets one by one, searching for her wallet. He had to move the body to do it, and she jerked a little as he did, like a ghastly puppet. Charlie waited, and at last he came back with her wallet. He handed Charlie her driver's license. Tracy Horton, she read. She doesn't look like a Tracy.
You got the address?
Clay scanned the road for police cars. Charlie read it quickly and handed the license back.
I'm going to give you 20 minutes before I radio this in, he told her. Use it.
Tracy Horton had lived in a small house off a back road. Her nearest neighbors' houses were visible, but Charlie couldn't imagine they would have heard her scream, if she'd managed to scream at all. There was a small blue car in the driveway, but if Tracy had been taken from her home, since presumably she hadn't just been wandering through that field, it could easily have been hers. Charlie pulled in behind the car and went to the front door. She knocked, wondering what she was going to do if someone answered. I really should have thought this through. She couldn't be the one to inform a parent, spouse, or sibling of the young woman's death. Why did I assume she lived alone? No one answered. Charlie tried again, and when there was still no response, she tried the door. It was unlocked. Charlie walked quietly through the house, not really sure what she was looking for. She glanced at her watch. 10 of the 20 minutes had passed just driving here, and she had to assume that the police would get here faster than she did. Why did I follow the speed limit the whole way here? The living room and kitchen were clean, but they conveyed no information to her. Charlie didn't know what peach-painted walls said about a person, or the fact that there were 3 dining room chairs instead of 4. There were 2 bedrooms. One had the sterile air of a guest room that was slowly being taken over by storage. The bed was made and clean towels were folded on the chest of drawers, but cardboard boxes filled a quarter of the room. The other bedroom looked lived in. The walls were green, the bedspread pale blue, and there were piles of clothing on the floor. Charlie stood in the doorway for a moment and found she could not go inside. I don't even know what I'm looking for. This woman's life would be sifted through to the last grain by trained investigators. Her diary would be read, if she had one. Her secrets would be revealed, if she had any. Charlie didn't need to be a part of it. She turned and walked quickly but quietly back to the front of the house, almost running down the front steps. Standing by the car, she checked her watch again. 6 minutes before Clay called in the body. Charlie went to the little blue car and peered inside. Like the house, it was neat. There was dry cleaning hanging in the back window, and a half-empty soda in the cup holder. She walked all around it, looking for something. Mud in the tires, scratches in the paint. But there was nothing unusual. 5 minutes. She walked briskly through the unkempt grass that bordered the sides of the house. When she reached the backyard, she stopped dead. Before her were 3 huge holes in the ground, longer than they were wide. They looked like graves, but at a second glance they were too messy, their outlines poorly defined. Charlie walked around them in a circle. They were lined up next to one another, and they were shallow, but the dirt at the bottom was loose. Charlie grabbed a stick off the ground and poked it into the middle hole. It went in almost a foot before it was stopped by denser soil. The dirt dug out of them was strewn messily all around. Whoever dug the holes had carelessly tossed it everywhere, not bothering to pile it up. 2 minutes. Charlie hesitated for another moment, then lowered herself into the middle hole. Her feet sunk into the loose dirt, and she fought to steady herself, catching her balance. It wasn't too deep. The walls came up to her waist. She knelt and put her palm against the wall of the grave. The hole, she reminded herself. The dirt was loose here, too, and the wall was rough. Something had been hidden there, under the ground. The air is growing thin. I am running out of oxygen, and I will die like this, alone, in the dark. Charlie's throat seized. She felt as if she couldn't breathe. She climbed out of the hole and up onto the grass of Tracy Horton's backyard. Charlie took a deep breath, focusing all her attention on pushing away the panic. When she was free of it, she checked her watch. -1 minute. He's already called them. But something kept her there. Something familiar. The loose dirt. Charlie's mind raced. Something climbed out of these. From a distance, a siren was wailing. It would be here in no time. Charlie hurried to her car and pulled out of the driveway, taking the first corner without caring where it would take her. The holes stayed in her mind, the image like a stain. Chapter 6. Charlie slowed her car. With half the cops in Hurricane converging on the area, now was not the time to be stopped for speeding. She was grubby with dirt from the dead woman's backyard, and had a nagging feeling there was something she was forgetting about. John, she realized. She was supposed to meet him. She checked the clock on the dashboard. Almost 2 hours ago. Her heart sank. He'll think I stood him up. No, he'll think I'm dead, she amended. Given the perilous history of their relationship, he'd probably think the second was more likely. When she got to the restaurant where they had planned to meet, a small Italian place across town, Charlie ran in from the parking lot at full speed. She skidded to a stop in front of the teenage hostess, who greeted her with a flustered look. "Can I help you?" she asked Charlie, taking a step back. Charlie caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror behind the hostess counter. There were streaks of dirt on her face and clothes. She hadn't thought to clean up first. She quickly wiped her cheeks with her hands before answering the girl. "I'm supposed to be meeting someone. A tall guy, brown hair. It's kind of..." She gestured vaguely at the top of her head, attempting to indicate the habitual chaos of John's hair, but the hostess looked at her blankly. Charlie bit her lip in frustration. "He must have left. Of course he left. You're 2 hours late." "Charlie?" A voice rang out. "John." "You're still here?" she cried, too loud for the quiet restaurant, as he appeared behind the hostess, looking profoundly relieved. "I figured I might as well eat while I'm here." He swallowed what was in his mouth and laughed. "Are you okay? I thought you might not be coming." "I'm fine. Where are you sitting? Or are you still sitting? Well, I mean, you're obviously not sitting, you're standing, but I mean, before you were standing, where were you sitting?" Charlie ran her fingers into her hair and clenched her fists against her scalp, trying to reassemble her thoughts. She mumbled an apology to the room, not sure who it was for. John glanced around nervously, then gestured toward a table near the kitchen. There was a mostly empty plate with a half-eaten breadstick resting on it, a cup of coffee, and a second place setting, untouched. They sat down and he looked at her appraisingly. Then John leaned across the table and asked in a low voice, "Charlie, what happened?" "You wouldn't believe me if I told you?" she said lightly. His face remained concerned. "You're filthy. Did you fall down in the parking lot?" "Yes," Charlie said. "I fell in the parking lot and rolled down a hill and into a dumpster, then fell out of the dumpster and tripped on the way in. Happy? Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you have the right to disapprove of me." John pulled back in his chair, his eyes wide. He blinked hard, and Charlie sighed. "John, I'm sorry. I'll tell you everything. I just need some time. Some time to collect my thoughts and to clean up." She laughed, an exhausted, shaken sound, then buried her face in her hands. John leaned back and signaled for the waitress to bring the check. Breathing heavily, Charlie looked around the restaurant. It was almost empty. The hostess and the only other waitress were talking together near the door, with no apparent interest in anything their customers were doing. There was a family of 4 by the front window, the children just barely out of toddlerhood. One kept sliding out of his chair and onto the floor every time his mother turned her attention away. The other, a girl, was happily drawing on the tablecloth with markers. No one seemed to care what was going on. But the emptiness made Charlie feel exposed. "I'm going to go clean up," she said. "Bathroom?" John pointed. Charlie got up and left the table just as the waitress arrived to deliver his ticket. There was a payphone in the hallway, and Charlie stopped at it, wavering. She craned her neck to see if John was watching, but from where she stood, she could only see a tiny corner of their table. Quickly, she called Clay Burke's office. To her surprise, he answered. "You saw her backyard," he said. It wasn't a question. "Can you give me the other addresses?" Charlie asked. "There could be a pattern. Something."
There sure could, he said dryly. That's why I raced back to the station instead of sticking around to measure the holes. You have a pen?
Hang on. The hostess was briefly absent from her station, and Charlie dropped the phone, letting it swing on its metal cord as she hurried to the podium and snatched a pen and a takeout menu. She rushed back. Clay, go ahead. He recited names and addresses, and she scribbled them dutifully in the margins of the menu. Thanks, she said when he was done, and hung up without waiting for him to respond. She folded the menu and slipped it into her back pocket. In the bathroom, Charlie washed off as much of the dirt as she could. She couldn't clean her clothing, but at least her face was scrubbed, and her hair was rearranged a little more neatly. As she moved to exit the bathroom, an image flashed unbidden through her thoughts. It was the face of the dead woman. She could be your twin, she heard Clay say, in his low, authoritative voice. Charlie shook her head. It's a coincidence. He's right. How many brown-haired, college-aged women are there around here? The first victim was a man. It doesn't mean anything. She grabbed the doorknob to leave, but froze. It was just like in the library. Charlie released the knob, and it spun slowly back into position, releasing a horrible creak as it moved. The costumes had been disturbed, and the creaking noise was so faint and careful she scarcely even heard it. Charlie looked up from her game. There was a figure in the door. Charlie glanced wildly around the room, pulling herself back to the present. With a swell of panic, Charlie pulled on the bathroom door, but it had somehow sealed shut. She mouthed words, but no sound came out. I know you're there. I'm trying to get to you. I have to get inside, she screamed. The door burst open and Charlie fell into John's arms. Charlie! She collapsed to her knees. Charlie looked up to see the scattered handful of customers all staring at her. John glanced into the bathroom behind her, then quickly turned his attention back to Charlie, helping her to her feet. I'm okay. I'm fine. She shook loose of his hands. I'm fine. The door was stuck. I felt hot. Charlie fanned at her face, trying to make a sensible story of it. Come on, let's get to the car. He tried to take her arm again, but she shook free. I'm fine. She dug her keys out of her pocket and walked straight for the door, not waiting for him. An old woman was openly staring at Charlie, her fork suspended in the air. Charlie returned her stare. Food poisoning, Charlie said plainly. The woman's face went pale, and Charlie walked out the door. When they got out to her car, John sat down in the passenger's seat and looked at Charlie expectantly. You're sure you're okay? It's been a rough day, that's all. I'm sorry. What happened? Tell him what happened, Charlie thought. I want to go to my dad's, my old house, she said instead, surprising herself. Be honest, her inner voice said harshly. You know what kind of creature is doing this, and you know who built it. Stay focused. Right, he said, his voice softening. You haven't seen it since the storm. She nodded. He thinks I want to see the damage. She'd forgotten about the storm until now, but the sudden kindness in John's voice made her nervous. Is there anything left? She imagined the house razed to the ground and felt a sudden wrongness, like a part of her had been ripped away. She'd never thought of the house as anything but a house, but now, as she drove toward what was left of it, she felt a painful knot in her stomach. It was where all her clearest memories of her father were kept, his rough hands building her toys, showing her his new creations in his workshop, and holding her close when she was afraid. They'd lived there together, just the two of them, and it was the place where he had finally died. Charlie felt as if the joy, the sorrow, the love, and the anguish of their 2 lifetimes had poured off into the very bones of the old house. The idea of it being wrecked by a storm was an utter violation. She shook her head and gripped the wheel tighter, suddenly aware of how angry she was. Her love of the house, even of her father, could never be simple. They had both betrayed her. But now there was a new monster out there. She clenched her jaw, trying to fight the tears that welled up in her eyes. "Dad, what did you do?" As soon as they were out of the town center, Charlie sped up. Clay would be tied up dealing with the newest victim for a while, but eventually he would think to come to her father's house as well. She could only hope that she'd connected the dots first. "You're on the same side." Charlie put a hand to her head and rubbed her temple. The impulse to guard her father's reputation from what was coming was visceral, but it was also nonsensical. Less than a mile from the house, they passed a construction site. It was set back too far from the road for Charlie to see what it was, though it looked abandoned at the moment. "I did a little work over there when I first got here," John said. "Some huge demolition project." He laughed. "You have some weird stuff out here. You wouldn't know by looking at it." He studied the countryside for a moment. "Isn't that the truth?" Charlie said, not sure if there was something else she was supposed to say. She was still trying to calm herself. Finally, they came to her driveway. She pulled in with her eyes on the gravel, the house only a dark smudge in her peripheral vision. The last time Charlie had been here, she'd run in and out without pausing to look at anything. All she'd wanted was Theodore, and she had grabbed him and gone. Now she regretted her haste, wishing for some final mental image. "You're not here to say goodbye." She turned the car off, steeled herself, and looked up. The house was surrounded by trees, and at least 3 of them had fallen, striking the roof directly. One had landed squarely on the front corner, crushing the walls beneath its weight. Charlie could see through the broken beams and crumbled drywall into the living room. Inside, there was only debris. The front door was intact, though the steps to it were splintered and split. They looked as if they'd give way as soon as they bore weight. Charlie got out of the car and headed toward them. "What are you doing?" John's voice was alarmed. Charlie ignored him. She heard his door slam, and he caught her arm, wrenching her back. "What?" she snapped. "Charlie, look at this place. That house is going to fall over any day now." "It's not going to fall," she said flatly, but she did gaze up again. The house seemed to be listing to the side, though it must have been an illusion. Surely the foundation itself couldn't have sunk. "I'll be out before I get killed, I promise," she said more gently, and he nodded. "Go slow," he said. They carefully climbed the steps to the porch, staying close to the sides, but the wood was sturdier than it looked. They could have taken 3 steps to the right and walked through the open wall, but Charlie took out her key and unlocked the door as John waited patiently, letting her go through the unnecessary ritual. Inside, she paused at the foot of the stairs to the 2nd floor. The holes in the ceiling were beaming down shafts of thin sunlight, dimming as the sun began to wane. It made the place feel almost like some sort of shrine. Charlie tore her eyes away from the holes and started upstairs to her bedroom. As with the outdoor steps, she kept to the side, holding on to the banister. The water damage was visible everywhere. There were dark stains and soft spots in the wood. Charlie reached out to touch a place where the paint had bubbled out from the wall, leaving a pocket of air. Suddenly, a cracking sound came from behind her, and she spun around. John grabbed the banister, struggling to hold on as the stair gave way under him. Charlie reached out, but John braced himself unsteadily. He hissed and gritted his teeth. "My foot's stuck," he said, nodding down. Charlie saw that his foot had gone clear through the wood, and now the jagged edges dug into his ankle. "Okay, hold on," Charlie said. She crouched down until she could reach him on the step below her, though the awkward angle made it hard to maintain her balance. The wood was only rotting in some places, while in others it was still intact. She grabbed the smaller pieces and pulled them cautiously back from John's foot, her hands growing raw with the rough and splintered surface. "I think I've got it," John said finally, flexing his ankle. She looked up and grinned. "And you thought I was going to get myself killed?" John gave her a weak smile. "How about we both make it out alive?" "Right." They made their way up the rest of the stairs much more slowly, each of them testing their weight before they took the next step. "Careful," John warned as Charlie reached the top. "We won't be here long," Charlie said. She was much more aware of the danger now. The house's instability grew more obvious with each step they took. The very foundation seemed to wobble from side to side as they moved. Her old bedroom was on the undamaged side of the house, or the side not struck by trees at least. Charlie stopped in the doorway, and John came up behind her. The floor was strewn with glass. One window had been broken by something, and the shattered glass had blown into the room. She took a deep breath, and it was then that she saw Stanley. The animatronic unicorn had once run on a track around her bedroom. Now he was lying on his side. Charlie went to him and sat down, pulling his head into her lap and patting his rusty cheek. He looked as if he'd been torn violently from his track. His legs were twisted, his hooves missing chunks. When she looked around the room, she saw the missing pieces, still attached to the grooves in the floor. "Stanley has seen better days," John smiled ruefully. "Yeah," Charlie said absently, as she set the toy's head back on the floor. "John, can you turn that wheel?" She pointed to a crank soldered together at the foot of her bed. He complied, crossing the floor agonizingly slowly. Charlie bit back her impatience. He turned the crank and she waited for the littlest closet door to open, but nothing happened. John looked at Charlie expectantly. She stood and went to the wall where the 3 closets stood, closed and apparently untouched by the weather. Even the paint was bright and immaculate. Charlie hesitated, feeling as if she might be disturbing something that no longer belonged to her, then forced the smallest door open. Ella was there, the doll who had been the same size as Charlie when she was much younger. She, like Stanley, had once run around on a track, and she seemed to still be attached to it. She was entirely undamaged. Her dress was clean, and the tray she held in front of her was firm in her motionless hands. Her wide eyes had been gazing into the darkness since the last time Charlie saw her. "Hi, Ella," Charlie said softly. "I don't suppose you can tell me what I'm looking for." She scanned over the doll quickly and brushed at her dress. "You just want to stay in here from now on?" Charlie studied the tiny frame of the door. "I don't blame you." She closed the closet door again without saying goodbye. "So," she said, turning back to John. He seemed lost in thought, staring at something in his hand. "What is that?" Charlie asked. "A photo of you, when you were no bigger than her." John smiled and gestured toward Ella's door, then handed the picture to Charlie. It looked like a school photo. A short, chubby girl gave a toothy grin for the camera, minus one tooth. Charlie smiled back at her. "I don't remember this." "That doll is a little creepy, standing in the closet," John said. "I'm a bit on edge, I won't lie." "Waiting for a tea party," Charlie said acerbically. "How sinister." She started to leave the room, but as her hand touched the door frame, she paused. Doors. She stepped back through into her bedroom and looked for a long moment at each of the rectangular closet doors. "John," she whispered. "What?" John looked up, trying to follow Charlie's gaze. "Doors," Charlie whispered. She took several long steps back to study the whole wall at once. The scribbles all over her notebooks had been shaped like dozens, hundreds of rectangles. She drew them without thinking, as if they were pushing up through her mind, trying to break out of her subconscious. Now they had. "They're doors," she repeated. Yes, I see." John tilted his head curiously. "Are you okay?" "Yes, I'm fine. I'm not sure." She ran her eyes over the wall of the closets again. Doors, but not these doors. "Come on, let's go look at the workshop," John said. "Maybe we can find something else there." "Right." She gave a pained smile. She looked back once more at the 3 closets that sat in silence. John nodded, and they went cautiously back down the stairs, testing each step before they took it. Outside, they stopped by the car. The workshop was invisible from the driveway, hidden behind the house. The backyard had once been surrounded by trees, a small wood that acted as a fence. "Don't go into the woods, Charlie," she said, then smiled at John. "That's what he always told me, like something out of a fairy tale." They walked a bit farther, twigs snapping under their feet. "But the woods were only 10 feet deep," she said, still peering into the trees as though something might leap out. As a child, these trees had seemed impenetrable, a forest she might be lost in forever if she dared to wander in. She started toward what remained of them, then stopped dead when she saw where some of the fallen trees had landed. Her father's workshop had been crushed. A massive trunk had hit the workshop's roof dead center, and others had come with it on all sides. The wall closest to the house was still standing, but it was bowed beneath the sagging roof. It had been a garage when they moved in, and then it had become her father's world, a place of light and shadow that smelled of hot metal and burnt plastic. Charlie peered down at the rotting wood and broken glass with careful attention, looking for something she might otherwise miss. "We're definitely not going in there," John said. But Charlie was already lifting a piece of sheet metal that had once belonged to the roof. She threw it violently to the side, and it hit the ground with a resounding clang. John startled and kept his distance as Charlie continued to throw things. What are we looking for?" Charlie wrestled a toy from under the debris and threw it carelessly to the ground behind her, continuing to lift sheets of metal and toss them aside. "Charlie," John whispered, picking up the delicate toy and cradling it. "He must have made this for you." Charlie ignored him. "There's got to be something else in here." She fought her way deeper into the workshop, toppling a wooden beam out of her way. Her hand slipped on the wood, and she realized it was wet. Her arm was bleeding. She wiped her hand on her jeans. From the corner of her eye, she saw John set the toy carefully on the ground and follow her in. Amazingly, there were still shelves and tables standing upright, with tools and shreds of fabric where her father had last set them. Charlie glanced at them for a passing moment, then swept her arm across the table nearest her, knocking everything to the ground. She didn't pause to see what had fallen before moving to the shelves. She began picking things off the nearest shelf one item at a time, inspecting them and throwing them to the ground. When the shelf was empty, she grabbed the board itself with both hands, wrenching at it violently, trying to pull it from the wall. When it didn't come loose, she began pounding at it with her fists.
Stop! John ran to her and grabbed her hands, pinning them to her sides.
There has to be something here, she screamed. I'm supposed to be here, but I don't know what it is that I'm supposed to find.
What are you talking about? There's a lot left. Look at this stuff. He held the toy up to her again.
This isn't about the storm, John. It's not about happy memories or closure or whatever you think I need. This is about monsters. They're out there, and they're killing people. And you and I both know that there is only one place they could have come from. Here.
You don't know that, John began. Charlie looked at him with a stony rage, stopping him short.
I'm surrounded by monsters and murder and death and spirits.
At the last word, her fury ebbed, and she turned away from John, surveying the workshop. She wasn't sure now what damage the storm had done, and what had been her.
All I can think about is Sammy. I feel him. Right now, I can feel him in this place. But he's cut off. It doesn't even make sense. He died before my father and I moved here. But I know I'm here for a reason. There's something that I'm supposed to find. It's all connected, but I don't know how. Maybe something to do with the doors? I don't know.
Hey, okay. We'll find it together. John reached out for her. Charlie's strength gave way, and she let him pull her close, pressing her face into his shirt. I know it's hard to see everything torn apart like this, he said. Charlie's anger drained away, fading into exhaustion. She rested her head on John's shoulder, wishing she could stay like this just a little longer. Charlie, John said with alarm, and Charlie came back to attention. He was looking over her shoulder, in the direction of the house. The entire back face of the house had been torn open, as if someone had taken a massive hammer to it. Inside was only dark. That's right under your room, isn't it? We could have fallen through the floor, John said. That should be the living room, Charlie said, wiping her sleeve across her face. Yeah, but it's not. John looked at her expectantly. That's not even a part of the house, she said. A sudden spark of hope revived inside her. Something was out of place. That meant there was something to find. Charlie approached the chasm, and John didn't try to stop her as she climbed up several large slabs of broken concrete. John stayed a step behind her, close enough to catch her if she slipped. Charlie turned to him before entering. Thank you, she said. John nodded. I've never seen this room before, Charlie whispered as she crept into the hollow space. The walls were made of dark concrete, and the room was small and windowless, a box jammed into the house and sealed away between the rooms. There were no decorations, and nothing to indicate what was stored here. Just a dirt floor and 3 large holes, deep and oblong like graves. Those don't look like storm damage, John said. They're not. Charlie went up to the edge of the nearest hole, looking down. Were you expecting to find these? These holes were deeper than the ones she'd found at Tracy Horton's house. Perhaps it was the shadowy room, but these looked like real graves. They were a foot or so deeper than the ones she'd found before, and partially filled with loose dirt. John was standing patiently behind her, waiting for her answer. I've seen them before, she admitted. Behind the house of a dead woman. What are you talking about? Charlie sighed. There was another body. I found her today in a field. I called Clay, and then I went to her house while he waited for the rest of the cops to show up. There were holes like this in her backyard. That's what you wouldn't tell me? Another body? John sounded hurt, but his wounded expression lasted only seconds before it cleared.
He started scanning the room again, his eyes intent on the walls and floor. That and the fact that she looked like me, Charlie thought. "So what do you think the holes are?" he asked finally. Charlie barely heard him. Her gaze had fixed on the blank concrete wall on the far side of the room. It was empty, whitewashed, then left to turn gray with dust and mildew. But something drew her to it. Leaving John alone by the open graves, Charlie walked slowly to it, drawn there by a sense of sudden recognition. It was like she'd just remembered a word that had been on the tip of her tongue for days. She hesitated, holding her hands out flat, less than an inch from the wall, uncertain what was holding her back. She steeled herself and placed her palms against the wall. It was cold. She felt a slight shock of surprise, as though she'd expected to feel warmth from the other side. John was speaking, but to her it was only murmurs in the distance. She turned her head and delicately placed her ear against the surface, closing her eyes. Movement? "Hey!" John's voice broke her focus, waking her as if from a trance. "Over here!" She turned. John was bent over the mound of dirt next to the farthest grave. Charlie started toward him, but he put up a hand to stop her. "No, come around the other way." She carefully made her way around the perimeter of the little room until she was beside him. At first, she couldn't tell what he was trying to show her. Something was almost visible, veiled in a thin layer of dirt, so that it blended into the ground as if deliberately camouflaged. But eventually she saw it, rusted metal and the glint of a staring, plastic eye. She glanced at John, who just looked back at her. This was her territory now. Carefully, Charlie poked the mostly buried head of the thing with the toe of her sneaker, then yanked her foot back. The thing didn't move. "What the heck is this?" John asked, glancing around the room. "And why is it in here?" "I've never seen this before," Charlie said. She knelt, curiosity overtaking her fear, then used her hand to scrape aside some of the dirt, clearing off a little more of the creature's face. Behind her, John drew a sharp breath. Charlie just stared down. The creature had no fur, and its face was smooth. It had a short muzzle and oval ears sticking out from the sides of the head. It had the general appearance of an animal's head, though much larger than the animatronic animals from Freddy's. Charlie couldn't guess what kind of animal it was supposed to be. Running down the center of its face was a long, straight split, exposing wires and a line of metal frame. A thick plastic material was stuck to the face in large patches. Maybe it had been encased in it at some point. "Do you recognize it?" John asked quietly. Charlie shook her head. "No,